Section 28 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 8. Edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. The Sea Route to India. Vasco da Gama sails around Africa, A.D. 1498, by Gaspar Correa. Part 2. In the ship of Nicolas Coelho, there was a sailor who had a brother who lived with Nicolas Coelho, and was foster brother of a son of his. And the sailor brother told this boy of what they had all determined to do. This boy, being very discreet, said to his brother that they should all preserve great secrecy, so as not to be found out, for it was a case of treason, and he warned his brother not to tell anyone that he had mentioned such a thing to him. The boy, on account of the affection which he had for his master, Nicolas Coelho, discovered the matter to him in secret, and he at once gave the boy a serious warning to be very discreet in this matter, that they should not perceive that he had told them anything of the kind. With the firm determination which Nicolas Coelho at once formed to die sooner than allow himself to be seized upon, he became very vigilant both by day and night, and warned the boy to try to learn with much dissimulation all that they wanted to do, and by what means. The boy told him that they would not do it unless they could first concert with the other ships, so that they all should mutiny. At that, Nicolas Coelho remained more at ease, but was always very much on his guard for himself. As the storm did not abate, but rather seemed to increase, and as the cries and clamor of the people were very great, beseeching him to put back, Nicolas Coelho dissembled with them, saying, "Brothers, let us strive to save ourselves from this storm, for I promise you that as soon as I can get speech with the captain major, I will require him to put back, and you will see how I will require it of him." With this they remained satisfied. Some days having passed thus with heavy storms, the Lord was pleased to assuage the tempest a little, and the sea grew calm, so that the ships could speak one another. And Nicolas Coelho, coming up to speak, shouted to the captain major that, quote, "it would be well to put about, since every moment they had death before their eyes, and so many men who went in their company were so piteously begging with tears and cries to put back the ships. And if we do not choose to do so, it would be well if the men should kill or arrest us, and then they would put back or go where it was convenient to save their lives, which we also ought to do. If we do not do it, let each one look out for himself, for thus I do for my part, and for my conscience' sake, for I would not have to give an account of it to the Lord." End quote. Paulo da Gama, who also had come up within speaking distance, heard all this. When they had heard these words of Nicolas Coelho, who, on ending his speech, at once begun to move away, the captain major answered him that he would hold a consultation with the pilot and his crew, and that whatever he determined to do, he would make a signal to him of his resolution. During this time they lay hove to in the smooth water, because the wind never changed from its former point. Vasco da Gama, as he was very quick-witted, at once understood what Nicolas Coelho's words meant, and called together all the crew, and said to them that he was not so valiant as not to have the fear of death like themselves, neither was he so cruel as not to feel grieved at heart at seeing their tears and lamentations, but that he did not wish to have to give account to God for their lives, and for that reason he begged them to labor for their safety, because if the bad weather came again, he had determined to put back, but to disculpate himself with the king, it was incumbent upon him to draw up a document of the reasons for putting back, with their signatures. At this they all raised their hands to heaven, saying that its mercy was already descending upon them, since it was softening the heart of the captain major and inclining him to put back, and they said they all would sign the great service which he would render to God and to the king by putting back. Then the captain major said that there was no need of the signatures of all, but only of those who best understood the business of the sea. Then the pilot and master named them, and they were 3 seamen. Upon this the captain major retired to his cabin, and told his servants to stand at the door of the cabin, and put inside the clerks to draw up the document, and ordered the 3 seamen to enter, and, dissembling, he made inquiries as to returning to port, and all was written down, and they signed it. He then ordered them to go down below to another cabin which he had beneath his own for a store cabin, and he ordered the clerk to go down also with them, and he summoned the master and pilot, and ordered them below also, telling them to go and sign as the clerk was there. Then he called up the seamen one by one, and ordered them to be put in irons by his servants in his cabin, and heavy irons for the master and pilot. All being well ironed and bound, the captain major turned them out, and called all the men, ordering the master and pilot at once to give up to him all the articles which they had belonging to the art of navigation, or, if not, that he would at once execute them. Being greatly afraid, they gave everything up to him. Then Vasco da Gama, holding the instruments all in his hand, flung them into the sea, and said, "See here, men, that you have neither master nor pilot, nor anyone to show you the way from henceforward, because these men whom I have arrested will return to Portugal below the deck, if they do not die before that." For he was aware that they had agreed among one another to rise up and return by force to Portugal, and on that account had cast everything into the sea. "And I do not require master nor pilot, nor any man who knows the art of navigation, because God alone is the master and pilot, who has to guide and deliver us by his mercy if we deserve it, and if not, let his will be done. To him you must commend yourselves and beg mercy. Henceforward let no one speak to me of putting back, for know from me for a certainty that if I do not find information of what I have come to seek, to Portugal I do not return." Seeing and hearing these things, the crew became much more terrified, and with much greater fear of death, which they held as certain, not having either pilot or master, nor anyone who knew how to navigate a ship. Then the prisoners and all the crew on their knees begged him for mercy, with loud cries, the prisoners saying that they, being ignorant men and of faint heart, had come to an understanding to put the ship about, and return to the king and offer themselves for death if he chose to give it them, and they would have taken him a prisoner, that the king might see that he was not to blame for putting back. But this was not to have been done except with the will of all the people of the other ships. But since God had discovered this to him before they had carried it out, let him show them clemency, for well they saw that they deserved death from him, which was more than the chains which they bore. All the crew frequently called out to him for clemency, and not to put the prisoners below the decks, where they would soon die. Then the captain major, showing that he only did it at their entreaty, and not for any need which he had of them, ordered them to remain in their cabins in the forecastle, still in irons, and forbade their giving any directions for the navigation of the ship, except only for the trimming of the sails and the work of the ship. Vasco da Gama then ran alongside of the other ships and spoke them, saying that he had put his pilot and master in irons, in which he would bring them back to the kingdom, if God pleased that they should return there, and that they should not imagine that he had any need of their knowledge. He had flung into the sea all the implements of their art of navigation, because he placed his hopes in God alone, who would direct them and deliver them from the perils among which they were going. And on that account, since he had now made his men secure, let them secure themselves as they pleased, and without waiting for an answer, he sheered off. Nicolas Coelho felt great joy in his heart on hearing from the captain major that he had got his pilot and master thus secured from rising against him, since he had put them in irons, and without much dissimulation he spoke to master and pilot and seamen, saying that he was much grieved at the captain major's way of treating his ship's officers, whom he stood so much in need of in the labors they were undergoing. But what he had done was because of his being of so strong and thorough a temperament, as they all knew, and he had not chosen to wait for them to make entreaty for the liberty of the prisoners, but that whenever the ships again spoke one another, he would do this. This all the crew begged him to do with loud cries of mercy, since they would follow the flagship wherever it went. This Nicolas Coelho promised them, so they remained contented. Paulo da Gama had other conversations with the officers of his ship, with much urbanity, for he was a man of gentle disposition. He also promised them that he would entreat his brother on behalf of the prisoners, and bade all pray God for the saving of their lives, and that all would end well, so that all remained consoled. While these things were happening, the wind did not shift its direction, but, the sea being smoother, the ships were more easy, though they let in so much water that they never left off pumping. The captain major saw this, and that the ships had an absolute need of repairs, and also because they had no more water to drink, because, with the tossing about in the storm, many barrels had broken and given way. Under such great pressure, he stood in to land under sail, for the weather was moderate, and was beginning to be favorable. All were praying to God for mercy, and that he would grant them a haven of safety. Which God was pleased to do in his mercy, for presently he showed them land, at which it seemed that all were resuscitated from the death which they looked upon as certain if the ships were not repaired. After that, the wind came free, and they sailed along the land for several days, without finding where to put in. This was now in January of the year 1498. Thus they ran close to the land with a careful lookout, for they did not dare to leave the land from the great peril in which the ships were from the great leakage. Proceeding in this way, one day they found themselves at dawn in the mouth of a large river, into which the captain major entered, for he always went first, and all entered, and found within a large bay, sheltered from all winds, in which they anchored, and all exclaimed 3 times, "The mercy of the Lord God!" For which reason they gave this river the name of the River of Mercy. Here they soon caught much good fish, with which the sick improved, as it was fresh food, and the water of the river was very good. Now at this time, in all the ships, there were not more than 150 men, for all the rest had died. Soon after arriving at this place, the captain major went to see his brother and Nicolas Coelho, and they conversed, relating their hardships. And Nicolas Coelho related the treason which his men were preparing, to take him prisoner and return to Portugal, and they did not do it from the fear they had that the captain major would follow after them, and if he caught them, would have hanged them all, and they only waited for all to agree to mutiny, and he had sought those feigned words which he had spoken, and it had pleased God that Vasco da Gama had understood them, so that by his imprisoning his officers at once, all had remained secure. So all gave praise to the Lord for having delivered them from such great perils. Then they settled about refitting the ships, for they had all that was necessary for doing it. Although they had a beach and tides for laying the ships aground, for greater security it was ordered that they should be heeled over while afloat, and thus it was arranged for by all of them. While they were on the quarter-deck, Paolo da Gama entreated his brother to set the prisoners at liberty, which he did, setting free the sailors and the master and pilot, with the condition that, if God should bring them back to Lisbon, when he went before the king, he would present them to him in the same manner in chains, not to do them any harm, but only that his difficulties might be credited, and that for this he would give him greater favors, at which all the crews felt much satisfaction. Afterward they spoke with all the officers, and arranged for careening the ships, and went to look at them. They found there was no repairing the ship of Nicolas Coelho, as it had many of the ribs and knees broken. For that reason they at once decided to break it up, and then they cut out its masts and much timber and planks of the upper works, which, with the yards and spars of the other ships, they lashed together and fastened, and made a great frame, which they put under the side of the ship to raise it more out of the water. For this purpose they then discharged from the captain major's ship into that of his brother, which was brought alongside, all that they could of the stores and goods, and everything heavy below decks they put on one side of the ship, which caused it to heel over very much, and with the timber under the side, and the tackle fitted to the mainmast, they canted the ship over on one side so much that they laid her keel bare. And on the outer side they put planks, upon which all the crew got to work at the ship, some cleaning the planks from the growth of seaweed, others extracting the caulking, which was quite rotten, from the seams, and the caulkers put in fresh oakum and then pitched it over, for they had a stove in a boat where they boiled the pitch. The captains were occupied with their own work day and night, and gave much food and drink to the crews, so that they used such dispatch that in one day and one night, by morning, they had finished one side of the ship, very well executed, though with great labor in drawing out the water from the ship, which leaked very much lying thus on one side. When she was upright, they turned her over on the other side and did the same work, much better performed because the ship did not leak so much. And when it was completed, and the ship upright, it was so sound and watertight that for 2 days there was no water in the pump. Then they loaded it again with its stores, and transshipped it to the stores of the other ship, upon which they executed the before-mentioned caulking and repairs, so that it became like new. They then fitted them inside with several knees and ribs and inner planking, and all that was requisite, with great perfection, and collected the yards, spars, and all that they had need of belonging to the ship São Miguel, and the captain major took Nicolas Coelho on board of his ship, entertaining him well. They then took away from the ship much wood for their use, and beached the ship, and took away its rudder and undid it, and stowed away its wood and ironworks in case of its being wanted for the other ships, because they had all been built of the same pattern and size, as a precaution that all might be able to take advantage of any part of them. Then they burned the ship in order to recover the nails, which were in great quantity, and a great advantage for other necessities which they met with later. After they had thus repaired the ships, the captain major sent Nicolas Coelho with 20 men in a boat to go and discover the river, and he, after ascending it for 2 leagues, found woods and verdure, and farther on he found some canoes which were fishing, and the men in them were dark, but not very black. They were naked, having only their middles covered with leaves of trees and grass. These men, when they saw the boat, came to it and entered it in a brutish manner, and were in a state of amazement. No one knew how to speak to them, and they did not understand the signs which were made to them. So Nicolas Coelho made them go back to their canoes, and returned to the ships. But of the canoes, one followed after the boat, and the others returned to take the news to their villages. These men who came with the boat, at once, without any fear, entered the ship and sat down to rest, as if they were old acquaintance. No one knew how to speak to them. Then they gave them biscuit and cakes and slices of bread with marmalade. This they did not understand until they saw our people eat. Then they ate it, and as they liked the taste, they ate in a great hurry, and would not share with one another. While this was going on, they saw many canoes coming, and larger ones, with many of those people also naked, with tangled hair like Kaffirs, without any other arms than some sticks like half-lances, hardened in the fire, with sharp points greased over. The captain-major, seeing the other canoes coming, ordered the first come to go to their canoe, which they did unwillingly, and went out and remained to speak with those that were arriving, and went their way. The others arrived, and all wanted to come on board. As they were more than 100, the captain-major would not allow them, only 10 or 12, who brought some birds which were something like hens, and some yellow fruit of the size of walnuts, a very well-tasted thing to eat, which our men would not touch, and they, seeing that, ate them for our people to see, who, on tasting them, were much pleased with them. They killed one of the birds, and found it very tender and savory to eat, and all its bones were like those of a fowl. The captain-major ordered biscuit and wine to be given them, which they would not touch till they saw our people drink. He also ordered a looking-glass to be given them, and when they saw it, they were much amazed, and looked at one another, and again looked at the mirror, and laughed loudly, and made jokes, and spoke to the others who were in the canoe. They went away with the looking-glass, highly delighted, and left 6 birds and much of the fruit, and all went away. And in the afternoon they came again, but bringing a quantity of those birds, at which our men rejoiced very much, and filled hen-coops with them, because they gave them, and were satisfied with anything that was given them, especially white stuffs, so that the seamen cut their shirts in pieces, with which they bought so many of these birds that they killed and dried them in the sun, and they kept very well. Here it was observed that in this river there were no flies, for they never saw any all the time they were there, which was 20 days, and they went away because the crew began to fall ill. It seems that it was from that fruit, which was very delicious to eat, and the principal ailment was that their gums swelled and rotted, so that their teeth fell out, and there was such a foul smell from the mouth that no one could endure it. The captain-major provided a remedy for this, for he ordered that each one should wash his mouth with his own water each time he passed it, by doing which in a few days they obtained health. The captain-major made a hole with pickaxes in a stone slab at the entrance of this river, and set up a marble pillar, of which he had brought many for that purpose, which had 2 escutcheons, one of the arms of Portugal, and another on the other side of the sphere, and letters engraved in the stone which said, of the lordship of Portugal, kingdom of Christians. The captain major, seeing how much the seamen and masters and pilots worked, especially his own, notwithstanding the imprisonment which he had inflicted upon them, when he was about to quit this river of mercy, made them all come to his ship, where he addressed them all, beseeching them not to suffer weakness to enter their hearts, which would induce them to wish to commit another such error by harboring thoughts of treason, which is so hideous before God, and always brings a bad end to those who engage in it. He said that he well saw that faint-heartedness was the cause of what had passed, and that he forgave all, and that since the Lord had been pleased to deliver them from so many dangers as they had passed up to that time, by his great mercy, therefore, they should put their trust in him, who would conduct them in such manner as to obtain the result which they were going in search of, by which they would gain such great honours and favours as the king would grant them on their return to Portugal, and he would present them to the king, and would relate their great labours and services, and that they ought to bear in remembrance these great advantages, which would be such a cause of rejoicing for all of them. They, with tears of joy, all answered, Amen, Amen, may the Lord so will it of his great mercy. And they weighed anchors, and went out of the river with a land breeze. Sailing with a fair wind, they got sight of land, which the pilots foretold before they saw it. This was a great mountain which is on the coast of India, in the kingdom of Cananor, which the people of the country, in their language, call the mountain Delieli, and they call it of the rat. And they call it Mount Delhi, because in this mountain there were so many rats that they could never make a village there. As it was the custom to give the fees of good news to the pilots when they see the land, they gave to each of the pilots a robe of red cloth and 10 testoons, and they went on approaching the land until they saw the beach, and they ran along it and passed within sight of a large town of thatched houses inside a bay, which the pilots said was named Cananor, where many skiffs were going about fishing, and several came near to see the ships, and were much surprised, and went ashore to relate that these ships had so much rigging and so many sails and white men, which, having been told to the king, he sent some men of his own to see, but the ships had already gone far, and they did not go. In this country of India they are much addicted to soothsayers and diviners, especially on this coast of India, which is named the country of Malabar, and they call these diviners Canayates. According to what was known later, there had been in this country of Cananor a diviner so diabolical, in whom they believed so much, that they wrote down all that he said and preserved it like prophecies which would come to pass. They held a legend from him in which it was said that the whole of India would be taken and ruled over by a very distant king who had white people, who would do great harm to those who were not their friends, and this was to happen a long time later, and he left signs of when it would be. In consequence of the great disturbance caused by the sight of these ships, the king was very desirous of knowing what they were, and he spoke to his diviners, asking them to tell him what ships were those and whence they came. The diviners conversed with their devils, and told him that the ships belonged to a great king and came from very far, and according to what they found written, these were the people who were to seize India by war and peace, as they had already told him many times, because the period which had been written down was concluded. The king, much moved, asked them whether his kingdom would receive much injury. They replied that our people would do no harm except to those who did it to them. Upon this, the king became very thoughtful, and talked of this frequently with his people, who very much contradicted what the diviners said, and they told him not to believe them, for in this they never hit upon the truth, because at the time that our ships arrived, more than 400 years had elapsed, since in 1 year more than 800 sail of large and small ships had come to India from the ports of Malacca and China and the Liqueos, with people of many nations, and all laden with merchandise of great value, which they brought for sale. And they had come to Calicut, and had run along the coast, and had gone to Cambay. And they were so numerous that they had filled the country, and had settled as dwellers in all the towns of the sea-coast, where they were received and welcomed like merchants, which they were. When those people arrived thus on the coast of Malabar, everybody considered that they were the people whom their prophecies mentioned as those who would take India, and they had inquired of the diviners, who, looking at their records, told them not to be afraid, since the time when India was to be taken had not yet arrived. Thus it was, for those people had gone over all India, trading and selling their merchandise during many years, in which many of them married and established their abodes, and became naturalized in the country, and mixed up with the inhabitants of the country. Many others returned to their own country, and as no more ever arrived, they went on diminishing in number until they came to an end. But a numerous progeny remained from them, and because they were people of large property, and numerous in the towns where they resided, they had a quarter set apart, like as in Portugal and Castile in other times there used to be Jewries and Moorish quarters set apart, and they built houses for their idols, sumptuous edifices, which are to be seen at this day, and in the space of 100 years there did not remain one. All this they had got thus recorded in their legends, and since at that time so many people did not take India, how was it to be taken now by people who came from such a distance, and who would not come in sufficient numbers to be able to conquer it? And they mocked at what the soothsayers said. But the king, who put great trust in them, and whose heart divined what was going to come to pass, spoke to a soothsayer in whom he placed great belief, and told him to look and see upon what grounds he made his assertions, because if it was as he had been saying, he would labor to establish peace with the Portuguese in such a manner as to make his kingdom secure forever, and in this he would spend part of his treasure. The soothsayer answered, "Sire, I am telling you the truth, that these men will not bring so many people with them to seize upon countries and realms, but those who come, in whatever number they may be, will be able to prevail more with their ships than all as many as go upon the sea, on which account they must be masters of the sea, in which case of necessity the people of the land must obey them. And when they shall have become powerful at sea, what will happen to your kingdom if you have not secured peace with them? I tell you the truth, and you will see it with your eyes, and now follow what counsel you please." The king answered, "My heart tells me that you are speaking the truth, and I will do that which is incumbent upon me." The diviner said to him, "If before 5 years you do not see that I have told you the truth, order my head to be cut off." Upon which the king remained quite convinced, and determined in his heart to establish with the Portuguese all the peace and friendship that was possible. And because soon after news arrived that our people were at the city of Calicut, which is 12 leagues from Cannanore, the king sent men to Calicut, who always came to tell him of what happened there to our men. The ships continued running along the coast close to land, for the coast was clear, without banks against which to take precautions, and the pilots gave orders to cast anchor in a place which made a sort of bay, because there commenced the city of Calicut. This town is named Capocate, and on anchoring there a multitude of people flocked to the beach, all dark and naked, only covered with cloths halfway down the thigh, with which they concealed their nakedness. All were much amazed at seeing what they had never before seen. When news was taken to the king, he also came to look at the ships, for all the wonder was at seeing so many ropes and so many sails, and because the ships arrived when the sun was almost set, and at night they lowered out the boats, and Vasco da Gama went at once for his brother and Nicolas Coelho, and they remained together, conversing upon the method of dealing with this king, since here was the principal end which they had come to seek. It seemed to him that it would be best to comport himself as an ambassador, and to make him his present, always saying that they had been separated from another fleet which they came to seek for there, and that the captain major had come and brought him letters from the king. This they agreed upon together, and that Vasco da Gama should go on shore with that message sent by the captain major, who carried the standard at the peak. They also talked of the manner in which these things were to be spoken of. When all was well decided upon, Nicolas Coelho returned to the ship, and Vasco da Gama remained with his brother talking with the Moor Taibo, the broker, who told him not to go on shore without hostages, that such was the custom of men who newly arrived at the country, and the Moor said that this king of Calicut was the greatest king of all the coast of India, and on that account was very vain, and he was very rich from the great trade he had in this city. End of section 28. Read by Linda Johnson, September 2021. Section 29 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 8, edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Columbus discovers South America, A.D. 1498, by Clements Robert Markham. On September 25, 1493, Columbus sailed from Palos and began his second voyage of discovery. He had 17 vessels and about 1,500 men. In November, he discovered Dominica in the West Indies. Arriving at La Navidad Española, Haiti, he found that the colony which he had left there on returning from his first visit had been killed by the Indians. At a point farther east he founded Isabella, the first European town in the New World. In April 1594, he sailed westward and along the south shore of Cuba, which he mistook for a peninsula of Asia. He next discovered Jamaica, and in September returned to Isabella. The Indians rose in rebellion against the Spaniards, who had ill-used them, and Columbus quelled the insurrection in a battle on the Vega Real, April 25, 1495. He had before planned for the enslavement of hostile Indians, an act from which his reputation has somewhat suffered. Owing to hardship and discontent, some of the colonists carried complaints to Spain. Bishop Fonseca, who had charge of colonial affairs, upheld the complainants, and in 1495 Juan Aguado was sent as royal commissioner to Española. Aguado prepared a report, fearing the effects of which, Columbus returned to Spain at the same time, 1496, with him. A brother of Columbus was left in charge of the government at Española. The Spanish sovereigns, Ferdinand and Isabella, dismissed the charges against Columbus, and on May 30, 1498, he sailed from Sanlúcar on his third voyage to the New World. The great navigator was no longer the powerful, enduring man of 6 years before. Exposure, Months of sleepless watching, anxiety, and tropical fevers had at length done their work. The bright intellect, the vivid imagination, the great heart, the generous nature, would be the same until death, but the constitution was shattered. The admiral now suffered from ophthalmia, gout, and a complication of diseases. The last 6 years of his life were destined to be a time of much and cruel suffering, aggravated by ingratitude, perfidy, and injustice. In fitting out the third expedition, every petty annoyance and obstruction that the malice of Bishop Fonseca could invent was used to thwart and delay the admiral. Each subordinate official knew that insolence to the object of the bishop's envy and dislike, and neglect of his wishes, were the surest ways to the favor of his chief. One creature of Fonseca, named Gimeno de Briviesca, carried his insolence beyond the bounds of the endurance even of the dignified and long-suffering admiral, who very properly took him by the scruff of the neck on one occasion and kicked him off the poop of the flagship. The delays of Fonseca and his agents caused incalculable injury to the public service, as will presently appear. The sovereigns had ordered that 6,000,000 maravedis, about $10,000, should be granted for the equipment of the expedition, and that 8 vessels should be provided. The contractor for provisions was Donato Berardi, a Florentine merchant, settled at Seville, and, owing to his death, the contracting work fell upon his assistant, Amerigo Vespucci, who was very actively employed on this service from April 1497 to May 1498. In 1492, Vespucci came to Spain as a partner of an Italian trader at Cadiz named Donato Niccolini, and he afterward became the chief clerk or agent of Berardi. It was thus that Columbus first became acquainted with Amerigo Vespucci, when the admiral had reached the ripe age of 45. As for his provisions, a good deal of the meat turned bad on the voyage, and the contract was not very satisfactorily carried out. It is strange that this beef and biscuit contractor should have given his name to the New World, but perhaps not more strange than that a bacon contractor should be the patron saint of England and of Genoa. The admiral was most anxious to dispatch supplies and reinforcements to his brother, and he succeeded in sending off 2 caravels in advance, under the command of Hernandez Coronel, who had been appointed chief magistrate of Española. The other vessels consisted of 2 naos, or ships, of 100 tons, and 4 caravels. After months of harassing and unnecessary delay, they dropped down the Guadalquiver from Seville, and the admiral sailed. He touched at Porto Santo and Madeira, and reached Gomera on May 19th. Columbus had become aware, through information collected from the natives of the islands, that there was extensive land, probably a continent, to the southward. He had also received a letter from a skilled and learned jeweler named Jaime Ferrer, dated August 5, 1495, in which it was laid down that the most valuable things came from very hot countries, where the natives are black or tawny. These and other considerations led him to determine to cross the Atlantic on a lower parallel than he had ever done before, and he invoked the Holy Trinity for protection, intending to name the first land that was sighted in their honor. But he was impressed with the importance of sending help to the colony without delay. He therefore detached 1 ship and 2 caravels from Gomera to make the voyage direct. The ship was commanded by Alonso Sanchez de Carvajal of Baeza. 1 caravel was entrusted to Pedro de Arana, brother of Beatriz Enriquez and brother-in-law of the admiral. The other had for her captain a Genoese cousin, Juan Antonio Colombo. It will be remembered that Antonio, the brother of Domenico Colombo and uncle of the admiral, lived at the little coast village of Quinto, near Genoa, and had 3 sons, Juan Antonio, Matteo, and Amighetto. When these cousins heard of the greatness and renown of Christopher, they thought at least one of them might get some benefit from his prosperity. So the younger ones gave all the little money they could scrape together to enable the eldest to go to Spain. His illustrious kinsman welcomed him with affection, and as he was a sailor, he received charge of a caravel, in which trust he proved himself, as Las Casas tells us, to be careful, efficient, and fit for command. The 3 vessels sailed from Gomera direct for Hispaniola on June 21st. Columbus continued his voyage of discovery with 1 vessel and 2 caravels. Pero Alonso Niño, the pilot of the Niña in the first voyage, was with him. Herman Perez Mateos was another pilot, and there were a few other old shipmates in the squadron. The admiral touched at Buena Vista, one of the Cape de Verde Islands, remaining at anchor for a few days, and on July 5th he sailed away into the unknown ocean for many days on a southwest course. His intention was to go south as far as the latitude of Sierra Leone, 8 degrees 30 minutes north, and then to steer west until he reached land. After 10 days the vessels were in regions of calms, and the people began to suffer from the intense heat. The sun melted the tar of the rigging, and the seams of the decks began to open. For days and days the scorching heat continued, but at length there were some refreshing showers, and light breezes sprang up from the west. But their progress was very slow, and their stock of water nearly exhausted. So the admiral ordered the course to be altered to northwest in hopes of reaching Dominica. It was July 31st. The people were parched with thirst, and yet no land had been seen. In the afternoon of that day, the admiral's servant, Alonso Perez of Huelva, went to the masthead and reported land in the shape of 3 separate peaks. Columbus had declared his intention of naming the first land sighted after the Holy Trinity, and the coincidence of its appearing in the form of 3 peaks made a deep impression on his mind. The island of Trinidad retains its name to this day. The admiral gave heartfelt thanks to God, and all the crews chanted the Salve Regina and other hymns of prayer and praise. Meanwhile, the little squadron glided through the water, approaching the newly discovered land, and Columbus named the most eastern point Cabo de la Galera, by reason of a great rock off it, which, at a distance, looked like a galley under sail. All along the coast the trees were seen to come down to the sea, the most lovely sight that eyes could rest on. And at last, on August 1st, an anchorage was found, and they were able to fill up with water from delicious streams and fountains. The main continent of South America was seen to the south, appearing like a long island, and it received the name of Isla Santa. The point near the watering place was called Punta de la Playa. The western end of the island was named Punta del Arenal, and here an extraordinary phenomenon presented itself. A violent current was rushing out through a channel or strait not more than 2 leagues wide, causing great perturbation of the sea, with such an uproar of rushing water that the crews were filled with alarm for the safety of the vessels. The admiral named the channel La Boca de la Sierpe. He piloted his little squadron safely through it, and reached the Gulf of Paria, named by him Golfo de la Balena. The land to the westward, forming the mainland of Paria, received the name of Isla de Gracia. Standing across to the western side of the gulf, the admiral was delighted with the beauty of the country and with the view of distant mountains. Near a point named Aguja, the country was so fruitful and charming that he called it Jardines, and here he saw many Indians, among them women wearing bracelets of pearls, and when they were asked whence the pearls were obtained, they pointed to the westward. As many pearls as could be bartered from the natives were collected for transmission to the sovereigns, for here was a new source of wealth, another precious commodity from the New World. Columbus was astonished at the vast mass of fresh water that was pouring into the Gulf of Paria. He correctly divined the cause, and made the deduction that a river with such a volume of water must come from a great distance. His prescient mind showed him the mighty river Orinoco, the wide savannas, and the lofty range of the Andes. But the trammels of the erroneous measurements of astronomers bound them to Asia, and prevented him from picturing them to himself in the new world he had really discovered. That the land must be continuous appeared to be proved, not only from the deductions of science, but also from the word of God. For he believed it to be established from the revealed word, 2 Esdras, verse 42, that the ocean only covered 1/7 of the globe, and that the other 6/7 was dry land. Moreover, his splendid intellect was united with a powerful imagination. When he had grasped the facts with masterly intuition, his fancy often raised upon them some strange theory, derived partly from his extensive reading, partly from his own teeming brain. Thinking that a long and rapid course was insufficient to account for the volume of water and the violence of the currents, he conceived the idea that the earth, though round, was not a perfect sphere, and that it rose in one part of the equinoctial line so as to be somewhat of a pear shape. Thus he accounted for the exceptional volume of water by the motion of rivers flowing down from the end of the pear. One step farther in the realms of fancy, and he indulged in a dream that this center and apex of the earth's surface, with its mighty rivers, could be no other than the terrestrial paradise. Writing as one thought coursed after another in his teeming fancy, we find these passing whims of a vivid imagination embodied in the journal intended for the information of the sovereigns. But time was passing on, and it was important that he should convey the provisions with which his vessels were loaded to his infant colony. He had seen that another narrow channel led from the northern side of the Gulf, and had named it Boca del Dragon. On August 12th he had piloted his vessels to the Punta di Paria, and prepared to pass through the channel. At that critical moment it fell calm, while the two currents flowed violently toward the opening, where they met and formed a broken, confused sea. But the admiral made use of the currents, and by the exercise of consummate seamanship took his 3 vessels clear of the danger and out into the open sea. The islands of Tobago and Granada were sighted, receiving the names of Asuncion and Concepcion. Then the rocks and islets to the westward came in view, named the Testigos and Guardias, and the island Margarita. The latter name shows that the admiral had obtained the correct information from the natives of Paria respecting the locality of the pearl fishery. The admiral now crowded all sail to reach Hispaniola, intending to make a landfall at the mouth of the river Azuma, where he knew that his brother, the Adelantado, governor, had founded the new city, and named it Santo Domingo, in memory of their old father, Domenico Colombo. But the current carried him far to the westward, and on August 19th he sighted the coast 50 leagues to leeward of the new capital. On hearing of his arrival on the coast, Bartolome got on board a caravel and joined him, but it was not until the 31st that the two brothers entered San Domingo together, the admiral for the first time. Young Diego, The third and youngest brother welcomed them on their arrival. The admiral had been absent for 2 years and a half, during which time the adelantado had conducted the government of the colony with remarkable vigor and ability. Yet, owing to the mutinous conduct of the worst of the settlers, there was a very disastrous report to make. When the adelantado assumed the command on the departure of the admiral for Spain in March 1496, his first step, in compliance with the instructions he had received, was to proceed to the valley on the south side of the island, in which the gold mine of Hehman was situated, and to build a fort, which he named San Cristoval. He next, having received supplies and reinforcements, together with letters from the admiral, by the caravels under Nino, took steps for the foundation of the new capital. Still following his brother's instructions, he selected a site at the mouth of the river Azuma, where there were good anchorage in the bay and a fertile valley along the banks of the river. On a bank commanding the harbor, a fortress was erected and named Santo Domingo, while the city was subsequently built on the east bank of the river. It became the capital of the colony. Before long, Isabella on the north coast was entirely abandoned. Trees soon grew upon the streets and through the roofs of the houses. It presented a scene of wild desolation, and ghosts were believed to wander in crowds through the abandoned city. Ruins of the House of Columbus, of the church, and the fort can still be traced out by those who penetrate into the dense jungle which now covers that part of the coast. The next proceeding of the indefatigable adelantado was the settlement of the beautiful province of Charagua, forming the southwestern portion of the island. It was ruled over by a chief named Vespucci, with whom dwelt the famous Anacaona, his sister, widow of Caonabo, but, unlike that fierce Carib, a constant friend of the Spaniards. Vespucci met the adelantado in battle array on the banks of the river Neva, the eastern boundary of his dominions. But as soon as they were informed that the errand of the Spanish governor was a peaceful one, both Vespucci and Anacaona, who was a princess of great ability and of a most amiable disposition, received him with cordial hospitality. When, after a time, he opened the subject of tribute to them, they showed opposition. But Bartolome proved himself to be a masterly diplomatist, and in the end Vespucci not only consented to impose a tribute, the details of which were amicably arranged, but undertook to collect and deliver it periodically to the Spanish authorities. These Indians were quite ready to submit to beings who appeared to be superior in power and intelligence to themselves. If the sovereigns of Spain had trusted Columbus and his brothers fully and completely, had established trading stations and imposed a moderate tribute, and had absolutely prohibited the overrunning of the country by penniless and worthless adventurers, they would have had a rich and prosperous colony. The discontent and rebellion of the natives were solely caused by the misconduct of the Spaniards. An insurrection broke out in the Vega Real, headed by the chief Guarionesh, who, after suffering innumerable wrongs from the Spaniards, was at last driven to desperation by an outrage on his wife. He assembled a number of dependent caciques, but the news was promptly communicated to the garrison of Fort Concepcion and forwarded to Santo Domingo. The adelantado stamped out the rebellion with his accustomed vigor. He came by forced marches to Concepcion, and thence without stopping to the camp of the natives, who were completely taken by surprise. Guarionesh and the other caciques were captured, and their followers dispersed. Always generous after victory, Bartolome Columbus released Guarionesh at the prayer of his people, a measure which was alike magnanimous and politic. But it was impossible to rule over the natives satisfactorily until the Spanish settlers could be forced to submit to the laws, and the adelantado was not powerful enough to keep the bad characters in subjection. The loyal and decent men of the colony were in a small minority. The consequence was that the unfortunate Guarionesh was again goaded into insurrection. On the approach of the adelantado, he fled into the mountains of Sigüe on the northeast coast, and took refuge with a dependent cacique named Mayobanesh, whose residence was near Cape Cabron, the western extreme of the Samana Peninsula. A difficult and arduous mountain campaign followed, which Bartolome conducted with remarkable military skill. It ended in the capture and imprisonment of both the chiefs. Vecchio now announced that he had collected the required tribute, consisting of a very large quantity of cotton, and that it was ready for delivery. The adelantado therefore proceeded to Xaragua, and not only found this great store of cotton, but received an offer from the generous chief to supply him with as much cassava bread as he needed for the use of the colony. This was a most acceptable present, for the lazy, ill-conditioned settlers had neglected to cultivate their fields, and a famine was imminent. The adelantado ordered a caravel to be sent round to Xaragua to be freighted with cotton and bread, and returned himself to Isabella after taking a cordial farewell of his native friends. He had shown extraordinary talent in his government of the native population, and his rule had been a complete success. Always moderate in victory, he had suppressed the insurrections without bloodshed, and had conciliated the people by his moderation. He had made long and difficult marches, had subdued opposition by his readiness of resource and energy, and had administered the native affairs with humanity and excellent judgment. Unfortunately, his power was insufficient to cope successfully with the insubordinate Spaniards. The ringleader of the mutineers was Francisco Roldan, a man whom Columbus had raised from the dust. He had been a servant, and the admiral, noting his ability, had entrusted him with some judicial functions. When he sailed for Spain, he appointed Roldan chief justice of the colony. This ungrateful miscreant fostered discontent and mutiny by every art of persuasion and calumny at his command, and soon had a large band of worthless and idle ruffians ready to follow his lead. His first plan was to murder the adelantado and seize the government, but he lacked the courage or the opportunity to put it into execution. His next step was to march into the Vega Real with 70 armed mutineers and attempt to surprise Fort Concepcion. The garrison was commanded by a loyal soldier named Miguel Ballester, who closed the gates and defied the rebels, sending to the adelantado for help. Bartolome at once hastened to his assistance, and on his arrival at Fort Concepcion he sent a messenger to Roldan, remonstrating with him and urging him to return to his duty. But Roldan found his force increasing by the adhesion of all the discontented men in the colony, and his insolence increased with his power. All would probably have been lost but for the opportune arrival of Pedro Hernandez Coronel in February 1498, who had been dispatched from Sanlúcar by the admiral in the end of the previous year with reinforcements. He also brought out the confirmation of Bartolome's rank as adelantado. The adelantado was thus enabled to leave Fort Concepcion and establish his headquarters at Santo Domingo. He sent Coronel as an envoy to Roldan to endeavor to persuade him to return to his duty, but the mutineer feared to submit, believing that he had gone too far for forgiveness. He marched into the province of Xaragua, where he allowed his dissolute followers to abandon themselves to every kind of excess. The 3 caravels, which had been dispatched from Gomera by the admiral, unfortunately made a bad landfall and appeared off Charagua. Roldan concealed the fact that he was a leader of mutineers, and, receiving the captains in his official capacity, induced them to supply him with stores and provisions, while his followers busily endeavored to seduce the crews, and succeeded to some extent. When Roldan's true character was discovered, the caravels put to sea with the loyal part of their crews, while Alonso Sanchez de Carbajal, a loyal and thoroughly honest man, who was zealous for the good of the colony, remained behind to endeavor to persuade Roldan to submit to the admiral's authority. He only succeeded in obtaining from him a promise to enter into negotiations with a view to the termination of the deplorable state of affairs he had created, and with this Carbajal proceeded to Santo Domingo. Such was the state of affairs when Columbus arrived at the new seat of his government. His brother had ruled with ability and vigor during his absence, had administered native affairs very successfully, but his power had been insufficient to subdue the band of Spanish miscreants who were still in open mutiny. The admiral was filled with grief and disappointment at the turn affairs had taken. A thoroughly loyal man himself, with no thought or desire but for the good of the colony, he was thwarted by treacherous miscreants who cared for nothing but the accumulation of riches for themselves, and a life of indulgence and licentious ease. After long consideration, he resolved upon a policy of conciliation. The unsettled state of affairs was bringing ruin on the island, and the restoration of peace was an absolute necessity. The magnanimous Genoese was incapable of personal resentment. The men themselves were, indeed, beneath his contempt, but he felt bound to treat with them and even to make great concessions, if necessary, for the good of the public service. The welfare of the colony was his sole object, and he did not hesitate to sacrifice every personal feeling to his sense of duty. It is with some impatience that one finds the grand schemes of discovery and colonization interrupted by such contemptible means, and the course of the narrative checked by the necessity for recording, however briefly, the paltry dissensions of vile miscreants such as Roldan and his crew. The mutineers were most unwilling to make any agreement. They were leading the sort of lawless and licentious life that exactly suited them, and were disinclined to submit to any authority. The interests of their leaders, however, were not quite the same, and the acceptance of advantageous terms would suit them. Carbajal was employed by the admiral to conduct the negotiations, while the veteran Ballester returned to Spain in November 1498 with the news of the rebellion, and a request from the admiral that a learned and impartial judge might be sent out to decide all disputes. It was finally agreed that Roldan should return to his duty, still retaining the office of Chief Justice, that all past offences should be condoned, and that he and his followers should receive grants of land with the services of the Indians. The admiral consented to these terms most unwillingly, and under the conviction that this was the only way to avoid the greater evil of civil dissension. He resolved, however, that any future outbreak must be firmly and vigorously suppressed by force. Although Roldan had now resumed his position as a legitimate official, ready to maintain order, it could hardly be expected that his fatal example would not be followed by other unprincipled men of the same stamp when the opportunity offered. Trouble arose owing to the conduct of a young Castilian named Hernando de Guevara. Roldan was established in Charagua when the youthful gallant arrived at the house of his cousin, Adrian de Mujica, one of the ringleaders in Roldan's mutiny, and fell in love with Higué Mota, the daughter of Anacauna. Guevara, for some misconduct, had been ordered by the admiral to leave the island, but instead of obeying, he had made his way to Jaragua, and caused trouble by this love passage, for he had a rival in Roldan himself, who ordered him to desist from the pursuit of the daughter of Anacauna, and to return to Santo Domingo. Guevara refused to obey, but he was promptly arrested and sent as a prisoner to the capital. When his cousin Mujica, who was then in the Vega Real, received the news, he raised a mutiny, offering rewards to the soldiers if they would follow him in an attempt to rescue Guevara. The admiral, though suffering from illness, showed remarkable energy on this occasion. Marching very rapidly at the head of 18 chosen men, he surprised the mutineers, captured the ringleader, and carried him off to the fort of Concepcion. Some severity had now become incumbent upon the authorities, and Mujica was condemned to death. The admiral regretted the necessity, but in no other way could a motive be supplied to deter others from keeping the country in a constant state of lawless disorder. Guevara, Riquelin, and other disorderly characters were imprisoned in the fort at Santo Domingo, and by August 1500 peace was quite established throughout the island. Thus had Columbus restored tranquillity to the colony. By prudent and conciliatory negotiations, during which he had exercised the most wonderful self-abnegation and patience, he had succeeded in averting the serious danger caused by the formidable revolt of Roldan. But as the habit of disorder was threatening to become chronic, he wisely took another way with the sedition of Mujica, maintaining order by a resort to prompt and vigorous action, and making a salutary example, which was calculated to be deterrent in its effects. With the restoration of peace, trade revived, and prosperity began to return. The receivers of grants of land found that they had a stake in the country, and sought to derive profit from their crops. Similar activity appeared at the mines, and the building at Santo Domingo progressed rapidly. The admiral began to hope that the first troubles incident to an infant colony were over, and that the time had arrived for Spain to feel the advantages of his great achievement. He now looked forward to further and more important discoveries, followed by colonization on the main continent. Yet at this very time, a blow was about to come from a quarter whence it was least to be expected, which was destined to shatter all the hopes of this long-suffering man and dissipate all his bright visions of the future. End of section 29. Read by Linda Johnson. September 2021.
Section 30 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 8, edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Establishment of Swiss Independence, A.D. 1499, Heinrich Zschokke. The powerful family of the Habsburgs, still rulers of the Tyrol, or eastern portion of the Alps, long claimed authority over the western port as well. The severity of their rule led to an organized resistance on the part of the mountaineers, and the natural strength of the country secured to its defenders victory after victory. The battles of Morgarten, 1315, and of Sempach, 1386, were each accepted as final by their own generation, but the House of Habsburg never formally relinquished its ancient rights, and its heads grew in power. From being Dukes of Austria, they advanced to be hereditary emperors of all Germany, and at length, in 1499, the powerful Emperor Maximilian determined to enforce his double authority as Duke and Emperor. His projects were encouraged by the discord rife among the little states or cantons which composed the Swiss League. The following account of the war that ensued is from the pen of a well-known Swiss historian, and is perhaps colored by rather more enthusiasm and racial pride than historic accuracy, yet the struggle was final. Never after did German or Austrian dispute the independence of the Swiss. The unfortunate consequences brought by success upon the natives are not only true, but profoundly worthy of note. Fortunately, danger and trouble soon appeared from abroad. This united all the cantons anew, and was therefore salutary. Maximilian I of Austria was Emperor of Germany. He had received from France the country of Lower Burgundy, and, to hold it more securely, incorporated it with the German Empire as a single circle. He wished to make Switzerland also such a German imperial circle. The Confederates refused, preferring to remain by themselves as they had been until then. In Swabia, the existing states had formed a league among themselves for the suppression of small wars and feuds. This pleased the politic emperor. By becoming an associate, he placed himself at the head of the league, which he was able to direct for the aggrandizement of his House of Austria. He desired that the Confederates also should enter the Swabian League. The Swiss again refused, preferring to remain by themselves as before. The emperor was irritated at this, and at Innsbruck he said to the deputies of the Confederates, "You are refractory members of the empire. Some day I shall have to pay you a visit, sword in hand." The deputies answered and said, "We humbly beseech your imperial majesty to dispense with such a visit, for our Swiss are rude men, and do not even respect crowns." The boldness of the Confederates wounded the Swabian League no less. Many provocations and quarrels took place here and there between the people on the borders, so that the city of Constance, for her own security, joined the Swabian League. For one day, a band of valiant men of Thurgau, incited by the bailiff from Uri, had tried to surprise the city, in order to punish her for her bravadoes against the Swiss. Neither were the Austrians good neighbors to the Grisons. The Tyrol and Engadine were constantly discussing and disputing about markets, privileges, and tolls. Once, indeed, in 1476, the Tyrolese had marched armed into the valley of Engadine, but were driven back into their own country, through the narrow pass of Finstermunds, with bloody heads. Now there was a fresh cause of quarrel. In the division of the Toggenburger inheritance, the rights of Toggenburg and the 10 jurisdictions had fallen to the counts of Mach, Saxe, and Montfort, and afterward, 1478 to 1489, by purchase to the ducal house of Austria, hence much trouble arose. As the Grisons had equal cause with the Confederates to fear the power and purposes of Emperor Maximilian, the Grey League, 1497, and that of God's House, 1498, made a friendly and defensive alliance with Zurich, Lucerne, Uri, Schweiz, Unterwalden, Zug, and Glarus. The 10 jurisdictions dared not join them for fear of Austria. Then the emperor restrained his anger no longer, and though already burdened with a heavy war in the Netherlands, he sent fresh troops into the Tyrol, and the forces of the Swabian League advanced and hemmed in Switzerland from the Grison Pass near Lusienstieg, between the Rhetian Mountains and Germany, along the Lake of Constance and the Rhine as far as Basel. Then Switzerland and Rhetio were in great danger, but the Grisons rose courageously to defend their freedom, as did all the Confederates. The Sargansers also, and the Appenzellers hastened to the Schallenberg. The banners of Valais, Basel, and Schaffhausen soon floated in view of the enemy. No man stayed at home. It was in February 1499 that the strife began. Then 8,000 imperialists entered the Grison territory of Munsterthal and Engadine. Louis of Brandas, the emperor's general, with several thousand men, surprised and held the pass of Lusienstieg, and by the treachery of 4 burghers the little city of Meinfeld. But the Grisons retook Lusienstieg, and 800 Swabians here found their death. The rest fled to Balzers. Then the Confederates passed the Rhine near Asmus, and with the Grisons obtained a great victory near Triesen. The Swabian nobility, with 10,000 soldiers, were posted near St. John's, at Hochst and Hard, between Bregenz and Fusach. 8,000 Confederates killed nearly half the enemy's army, ascended as far as the forests of Bregenz, and imposed contributions on the country. 10,000 other Confederates passed victoriously over the Hegau, and in 8 days burned 20 villages, hamlets, and castles. Skirmish followed quickly upon skirmish, battle upon battle. The enemy, indeed, issuing from Constance, succeeded in surprising the Confederate garrison of Ermatingen while asleep, and in murdering in their beds 63 defenseless men. But they bloodily expiated this in the wood of the Swaterlocks, whence 18,000 of them, vanquished by 2,000 Confederates, fled in such haste that the city gates of Constance were too narrow for the fugitives, and the number of their dead exceeded that of the Swiss opposed to them. A body of Confederates on the Upper Rhine penetrated into Walgau, where the enemy were entrenched near Frestens, and, 14,000 strong, feared not the valor of the Swiss. But when Henry Wallab, the hero of Uri, had passed the Lancasterberg with 2,000 brave men, and burned at the strong entrenchment, his heroic death was the signal of victory to the Confederates. They rushed under the thunder of artillery into the ranks of Austria and dealt their fearful blows. 3,000 dead bodies covered the battlefield of Frestens. Such Austrians as were left alive fled in terror through the woods and waters. Then each Swiss fought as though victory depended on his single arm, for Switzerland and Swiss glory each flew joyously to meet danger and death, and counted not the number of the enemy. And wherever a Swiss banner floated, there was more than one like John Walla of Glarus, who near Gams and Rheinthal measured himself singly with 30 horsemen. The Grisons also fought with no less glory. Witness the Malzerheide in Tyrol, where 15,000 men under Austrian banners, behind strong entrenchments, were attacked by only 8,000 Grisons. The ramparts were turned, the entrenchments stormed. Benedict Fontana was first on the enemy's wall. He had cleared the way. With his left hand holding the wide wound from which his entrails protruded, he fought with his right and cried, "Forward now, fellow leaguers! Let not my fall stop you! It is but one man the less. Today you must save your free fatherland and your free leagues. If you are conquered, you leave your children in everlasting slavery." So said Fontana and died. The Malzerheide was full of Austrian dead. Nearly 5,000 fell. The Grisons had only 200 killed and 700 wounded. When Emperor Maximilian in the Netherlands heard of so many battles lost, he came and reproached his generals and said to the princes of the German Empire, "Send to me auxiliaries against the Swiss, so bold to have attacked the empire. For these rude peasants, in whom there is neither virtue nor noble blood nor magnanimity, but who are full of coarseness, pride, perfidy, and hatred of the German nation, have drawn into their party many hitherto faithful subjects of the empire." But the princes of the empire delayed to send auxiliaries, and the emperor then learned, with increasing horror, that his army sent over the Engadine Mountains to suppress the Grison League had been destroyed in midsummer by avalanches, famine, and the masses of rock which the Grisons threw down from the mountains. Then that on the bloody height of Bruderholz, not far from Basel, 1,000 Swiss had vanquished more than 4,000 of their enemies, and that shortly after, in the same region near Dornach, 6,000 Confederates had obtained a brilliant victory over 15,000 Austrians, killing 3,000 men with their general Henry of Furstenberg. Then the emperor reflected that within 8 months the Swiss had been 8 times victorious in 8 battles, and he decided to end a war in which more than 20,000 men had already fallen, and nearly 2,000 villages, hamlets, castles, and cities had been destroyed. Peace was negotiated and concluded on September 22, 1499, in the city of Basel. The emperor acknowledged the ancient rights and the conquests of the Confederates, and granted to them, moreover, the ordinary jurisdiction over Thurgau, which, with the criminal jurisdiction and other sovereign rights, had until then belonged to the city of Constance. Thenceforward, emperors thought no more of dissolving the Confederacy, or of incorporating it with the German Empire. In the fields of Frestens, of Malzerheide, and Dornach were laid the first foundation stones of Swiss independence of foreign power. The confederated cannons thankfully acknowledged what Basel and Schaffhausen had constantly done in these heroic days for the whole confederacy, and that warlike Appenzell had never been backward at the call of glory and liberty. Therefore Basel, June 9, 1501, and flourishing Schaffhausen, August 9, 1501, were received into the perpetual Swiss bond, and finally, 1513, Appenzell, already united in perpetual alliance with most of the cantons, was acknowledged as co-equal with all the confederates. Thus, in the 205th year after the deed of William Tell, the confederacy of the 13 cantons was completed, but Valais and Grisons were considered as cantons allied to the confederacy, as were St. Gallen and Mulhausen and Rothweil and Swabia, and other cities, all free places, subject to no prince, united with the Swiss by a defensive alliance. At that period, the 13 cantons of the Swiss Confederacy were not yet, as now, equal in virtue of the bond, or bound together directly by one and the same covenant. They were properly united only with the 3 cantons of Uri, Schweiss, and Unterwalden, as with a common centre, but among themselves by special treaties. Each canton was attentive to its own interests and glory, seldom to those of the others or to the welfare of the whole confederacy. Fear of the ambition and power of the neighbouring lords and princes had drawn them together more and more. So long as this fear lasted, their union was strong. As the governments were independent of each other so far as their covenants allowed, and of foreign princes also, they called themselves Free Swiss. But within the country districts there was little freedom for the people. Only in the shepherd cantons, Uri, Schweiss, and Unterwalden, also Zug, Glarus, and Appenzell, did the country people possess equal rights, and in the city cantons, only the burghers of the cities, and often, even among these latter, only a few rich or ancient families. The rest of the people, dependent on the cities, having been either purchased or conquered, were subjects, often indeed serfs, and enjoyed only the limited rights which they had formerly possessed under the counts and princes. Even the shepherd cantons held subjects whom they, like princes, governed by their bailiffs, and the Confederate cantons and cities would by no means allow their subjects to purchase their freedom, as the old counts and lords had formerly permitted the Confederates themselves to do. But the people cared little for liberty. Made rude and savage by continued wars, they loved only quarrels and combat, revels and debauchery, when there was no war in their own country. The young men, greedy of booty, followed foreign drums and fought the battles of princes for hire. There were no good schools in the villages, and the clergy cared little for this. Indeed, the morals of the clergy were often no less depraved than those of the citizens and country people. Even in the convents, great disorders frequently prevailed with great wealth. Many of the priests were very ignorant, many drank, gambled, and blasphemed, many led shameless lives. In the chief cities of the cantons, debauchery and dissipation were rife. There was much division between the citizens and councillors, envy and distrust between the different professions. The lords, when once seated in the great and small councils, legislative and executive, cared more for themselves and their families than for the welfare of the citizens. They endeavored to advance their sons and relatives and to procure lucrative offices for them. In all the cantons there were certainly some great patriotic souls who preferred the interests of their country to their own, but no one listened to them. As Switzerland had now no foreign wars to fear, and the neighboring kings and princes were pleased to have in their armies Swiss, for whose life and death they cared much less than for the life and death of their own subjects, the principal families of the city and country cantons took advantage of these circumstances to open fountains of wealth for themselves. The desire of the kings to enlist valiant Swiss favored the avidity of the council lords, as did the wish of the young men to get booty. In spite of the positive prohibition of the magistrates, thousands of young men and often enlisted in foreign service, for most of them perished miserably because no one cared for them. Therefore, the governments judged it best to make treaties with the kings for the raising of Swiss regiments, commanded by national officers, subject to their own laws and regularly paid, so that each government could take care of its subjects when abroad. "Confederates, you require a vent for your energies," had Rudolf Reding of Schwitz already said when, years before, he saw the free life of the young men after the Burgundian War. Now began the letting out of Swiss, Grisons, and Valesians to foreign military service by their governments. The first treaty of this nature was made by the King of France, 1479 to 1480, with the Confederates in Lucerne. Next, the House of Austria hired mercenaries, 1499. The princes of Italy did the same, as did others afterward. Even the popes themselves wanted a lifeguard of Swiss. The first, 1503, was Pope Julius II, who was often engaged in war. Switzerland suffered much from this course. Many a field remained untilled, many a plough stood still because the husbandman had taken mercenary arms. And if he returned alive, he brought back foreign diseases and vices, and corrupted the innocent by evil example, for he had acquired but little virtue in the wars. Only the sons of the patricians and council lords obtained captaincies, commands, and riches, by which they increased their influence and consideration in the land, and could oppress others. They prided themselves on the titles of nobility and decorations conferred by kings, and imagined these to be of value, and that they themselves were worth more than other Swiss. When the kings perceived the cupidity and folly of the Swiss, they took advantage of them for their own profit, and sent ambassadors into Switzerland, distributed presents, granted gratifications and pensions to their partisans in the councils, and for these the council lords became willing servants of foreign princes. Then one canton was French, another Milanese, one Venetian, another Spanish, but rarely was one Swiss. This redounded greatly to the shame of the Swiss. When the German emperor and the King of France were, at the same time, canvassing the favor of the cantons and bargaining in competition for troops, so great was the contempt or insolence of the French ambassador at Bern, 1516, that he distributed the royal pensions to the lords by sound of trumpet. At Freiburg he poured out silver crowns upon the ground, and while he heaped them up with a shovel, said to the bystanders, "Does not this silver jingle better than the emperor's empty words?" So much had love of money debased the Swiss. The 12 cantons, Appenzell being the only exception, were at one moment allied with Milan against France, at the next with France against Milan. Milan was rightly called the Schweitzer's grave. It was not unusual for Confederates to fight against Confederates on foreign soil and to kill each other for hire. The ecclesiastical lord Matthew Schinner, Bishop of Sion and Valais, a very deceitful man, helped greatly to occasion this. According as he was hired, he intrigued in Switzerland, sometimes for the King of France, sometimes against France for the Pope, who in payment even made him cardinal and ambassador to the Confederacy. The mercenary wars of the Swiss upon foreign battlefields were not wars for liberty or for honor, but these hirelings of princes maintained their reputation for valor even there. With the aid of several thousand Confederates, the King of France subjected the whole of Lombardy in the space of 20 days. But the expelled duke of the country soon returned with 5,000 Swiss whom he had enlisted contrary to the will of the magistracy to drive out the French. Then the King of France received 20,000 men from the cantons with whom he was allied, maintained himself in Italy and gave to the three cantons, Uri, Schweitz, and Unterwalden, 1502 to 1503, the districts of Clenza, Riviera, and Valennes. But as soon as the king thought he could do without the Swiss, he paid them badly and irregularly. Cardinal Schinner, pleased at this, immediately shook a bag of gold with 53,000 guilders in favor of the Pope and of Venice. At once, 1512, 20,000 Swiss and Grisons crossed the high Alps and joined the Venetians against the French. The Grisons took possession of Valtellina, Chiavenna, and Bormio. They asserted that, a century before, an ejected Duke of Milan had ceded these valleys to the bishopric of Coire. The confederates of the 12 cantons subjected Lugano, Locarno, and Valmaggia. The French were driven out of Lombardy, and the young Duke Maximilian Sforza, son of him who had been dispossessed by them, was reinstated in his father's inheritance at Milan. Victorious for him, the Confederates beat the French near Novara, June 6, 1513. 2,000 Swiss fell, it is true, but 10,000 of the enemy. Still more murderous was the 2 days' battle of Melangano, September 14, 1515, in which barely 10,000 Swiss fought against 50,000 French. They lost the battlefield indeed, but not their honor. They sadly retreated to Milan with their field pieces on their backs, their wounded in the center of their army. The enemy lost the flower of their troops, and called this action the Battle of the Giants. Then the King of France, Francis I, terrified by a victory which resembled a defeat, made, in the next year, a perpetual peace with the Confederates, and by money and promises persuaded some to furnish him with troops, the others that they would allow no enrolling by his enemies. Thus the Confederates once more helped him against the Emperor and the Pope and against Milan, and the king concluded a friendly alliance with him in 1521. During many years they shed their blood for him on the battlefields of Italy, without good result, without advantage, except that the Confederacy stood godmother to his newborn son. Each canton sent to Paris for the fete a deputy with a baptismal present of 50 ducats. More agreeable to the king than this present was the promptitude with which the Swiss sent 16,000 of their troops to his assistance in Italy. However, as they had lost, April 20th, 1522, 3,000 men near Bicocca, as of nearly 15,000 men who entered Lombardy 1524, hardly 4,000 came back. As finally in the battle near Paggia, February 24th, 1525, in which the king himself became prisoner to the emperor, the Swiss experienced a fresh loss of 7,000 men. They by degrees lost all taste for Italian wars. End of section 30.
Section 31 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 8. Edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Amerigo Vespucci in America, A.D. 1499, by Amerigo Vespucci. It was the claim of Amerigo Vespucci that he accompanied 4 expeditions to the New World, and that he wrote a narrative of each voyage. According to Amerigo, the first expedition sailed from Spain in 1497, the second, of which his own account is here given, in 1499, both by order of King Ferdinand. Grave doubt has been thrown upon the first of these expeditions, the sole authority for which is Vespucci himself. The name America was given to the 2 continents in honor of this naval astronomer on the authority of an account of his travels published in 1507, in which he is represented as having reached the mainland in 1497. The justice of this naming has always been, and still remains, a matter of warm dispute among historical critics. But at the age of almost 50, he was born in Florence in 1451. Vespucci unquestionably promoted and made a voyage to the New World. In May of 1499, he sailed from Spain with Alonso de Ojeda, who commanded 4 vessels. During the summer, they explored the coast of Venezuela, Little Venice, a name first given by Ojeda to a gulf of the Caribbean Sea, on the shores of which were cabins built on piles over the water, reminding him of Venice in Italy. Ojeda, who was but little acquainted with navigation, entered upon this voyage more as a marauding enterprise than an expedition of discovery, and he gladly availed himself of Amerigo's scientific ability. Vespucci was also able to command the financial support of his wealthy acquaintances. It is said that many of the former sailors of Columbus shipped with this expedition. The following account was written by Amerigo in a letter to Lorenzo Pier Francesco of the Medici family of Florence, from whom Vespucci had held certain business commissions in Spain. Respecting this letter, an Italian critic observes that it is the most ancient known writing of Amerigo relating to his voyages to the New World, having been composed within a month after his return from his second voyage, and remaining buried in our archives for a long time. It is a precious monument, for without it we should have been left in ignorance of the great additions which he made to astronomical science. The most rigorous examination of this letter cannot bring to light the least circumstance proving anything for or against the accuracy of his first voyage. The diffidence with which he commences the matter is, however, a strong indication that he had previously written an account of his first voyage to the same Lorenzo de' Medici, to whom he addressed this communication. Most excellent and dear Lord, it is a long time since I have written to your Excellency, and for no other reason than that nothing has occurred to me worth of being commemorated. This present letter will inform you that about a month ago I arrived from the Indies by the way of the great ocean, brought by the grace of God safely to this city of Seville. I think your Excellency will be gratified to learn the result of my voyage and the most surprising things which have been presented to my observation. If I am somewhat tedious, let my letter be read in your most idle hours, as fruit is eaten after the cloth is removed from the table. Your Excellency will please to note that, commissioned by His Highness the King of Spain, I set out with 2 small ships on May 18th, 1499, on a voyage of discovery to the southwest, by way of the great ocean, and steered my course along the coast of Africa until I reached the Fortunate Islands, which are now called the Canaries. After having provided ourselves with all things necessary, first offering our prayers to God, we set sail from an island which is called Gomera, and turning our prows southwardly, sailed 24 days with a fresh wind, without seeing any land. At the end of these 24 days, we came within sight of land, and found that we had sailed about 1,300 leagues, and were at that distance from the city of Cadiz in a southwesterly direction. When we saw the land, we gave thanks to God, and then launched our boats, and with 16 men went to shore, which we found thickly covered with trees, astonishing both on account of their size and their verdure, for they never lose their foliage. The sweet odor which they exhaled, for they are all aromatic, highly delighted us, and we were rejoiced in regaling our nostrils. We rowed along the shore in the boats to see if we could find any suitable place for landing, but after toiling from morning till night, we found no way or passage which we could enter and disembark. We were prevented from doing so by the lowness of the land, and by its being so densely covered with trees. We concluded, therefore, to return to the ships and make an attempt to land in some other spot. We observed one remarkable circumstance in these seas. It was that at 15 leagues from the land we found the water fresh, like that of a river, and we filled all our empty casks with it. Having returned to our ships, we raised anchor and set sail, turning our prows southwardly, as it was my intention to see whether I could sail around a point of land which Ptolemy called the Cape of Catagara, which is near the Great Bay. In my opinion, it was not far from it, according to the degrees of latitude and longitude which will be stated hereafter. Sailing in a southerly direction along the coast, we saw 2 large rivers issuing from the land, one running from the west to the east, and being 4 leagues in width, which is 16 miles. The other ran from south to north, and was 3 leagues wide. I think that these 2 rivers, by reason of their magnitude, caused the freshness of the water in the adjoining sea. Seeing that the coast was invariably low, we determined to enter one of these rivers with the boats, and descend it till we either found a suitable landing place or an inhabited village. Having prepared our boats, and put in provision for 4 days with 20 men well armed, we entered the river, and rowed nearly 2 days, making a distance of about 18 leagues. We attempted to land in many places, by the way, but found the low land still continuing, and so thickly covered with trees that a bird could scarcely fly through them. While thus navigating the river, we saw very certain indications that the inland parts of the country were inhabited. Nevertheless, as our vessels remained in a dangerous place in case an adverse wind should arise, we concluded at the end of the 2 days to return. Here we saw an immense number of birds, of various forms and colors, a great number of parrots, and so many varieties of them that it caused us great astonishment. Some were crimson-colored, others of variegated green and lemon, others entirely green, and others again that were black and flesh-colored. Oh, the song of other species of birds, also, was so sweet and so melodious, as we heard it among the trees, that we often lingered, listening to their charming music. The trees, too, were so beautiful and smelled so sweetly that we almost imagined ourselves in a terrestrial paradise. Yet not one of those trees, or the fruit of them, was similar to the trees or fruits in our part of the world. On our way back, we saw many people of various descriptions fishing in the river. Having arrived at our ships, we raised anchor and set sail, still continuing in a southerly direction, and standing off to sea about 40 leagues. While sailing on this course, we encountered a current which ran from southeast to northwest. So great was it, and ran so furiously, that we were put into great fear, and were exposed to great peril. The current was so strong that the Strait of Gibraltar and that of the Faro of Messina appeared to us like mere stagnant water in comparison with it. We could scarcely make any headway against it, though we had the wind fresh and fair. Seeing that we made no progress, or but very little, and the danger to which we were exposed, we determined to turn our prows to the northwest. As I know, if I remember right, that Your Excellency understands something of cosmography, I intend to describe to you our progress in our navigation by the latitude and longitude. We sailed so far south that we entered the torrid zone and penetrated the circle of Cancer. You may rest assured that for a few days while sailing through the torrid zone, we saw 4 shadows of the sun, as the sun appeared in the zenith to us at midday. I would say that the sun, being in our meridian, gave us no shadow. But this I was enabled many times to demonstrate to all the company, and took their testimony of the fact. This I did on account of the ignorance of the common people, who do not know that the sun moves through its circle of the zodiac. At one time I saw our shadow to the south, at another to the north, at another to the west, and at another to the east, and sometimes, for an hour or 2 of the day, we had no shadow at all. We sailed so far south in the torrid zone that we found ourselves under the equinoctial line, and had both poles at the edge of the horizon. Having passed the line, and sailed 6 degrees to the south of it, we lost sight of the North Star altogether, and even the stars of Ursa Minor. Or to speak better, the guardians which revolve about the firmament were scarcely seen. Very desirous of being the author who should designate the other polar star of the firmament, I lost many a time my night's sleep while contemplating the movement of the stars around the southern pole, in order to ascertain which had the least motion, and which might be nearest to the firmament. But I was not able to accomplish it with such bad nights as I had, and such instruments as I used, which were the quadrant and astrolabe. I could not distinguish a star which had less than 10 degrees of motion around the firmament, so that I was not satisfied within myself to name any particular one for the pole of the meridian, on account of the large revolution which they all made around the firmament. While I was arriving at this conclusion, as the result of my investigations, I recollected a verse of our poet Dante, which may be found in the first chapter of his Purgatory, where he imagines he is leaving this hemisphere to repair to the other, and attempting to describe the Antarctic pole, says, "I turned to the right hand and fixed my mind on the other pole. I saw 4 stars, not seen before, since the time of our first parents. Joyous appear the heavens for their glory. O northern lands are widowed since deprived of such a sight." It appears to me that the poet wished to describe in these verses, by the 4 stars, the pole of the other firmament, and I have little doubt even now that what he says may be true. I observed 4 stars in the figure of an almond, but which had little motion, and if God gives me life and health, I hope to go again into that hemisphere, and not to return without observing the pole. In conclusion, I would remark that we extended our navigation so far south that our difference of latitude from the city of Cadiz was 60 degrees and a half, because at that city the pole is elevated 35 degrees and a half, and we had passed 6 degrees beyond the equinoctial line. Let this suffice as to our latitude. You must observe that this our navigation was in the months of July, August, and September, when, as you know, the sun is longest above the horizon in our hemisphere, and describes the greatest arch in the sky and the least in the night. On the contrary, while we were at the equinoctial line, or near it, within 4 to 6 degrees, the difference between the day and the night was not perceptible. They were of equal length, or very nearly so. As to the longitude, I would say that I found so much difficulty in discovering it that I had to labor very hard to ascertain the distance I had made by means of longitude. I found nothing better at last than to watch the opposition of the planets during the night, and especially that of the moon with the other planets, because the moon is swifter in her course than any other of the heavenly bodies. I compared my observations with the almanac of Giovanni di Montereggio, which was composed for the meridian of the city of Ferrara, verifying them with the calculations in the tables of King Alfonso, and afterward with the many observations I had myself made one night with another. On August 23rd, 1499, when the moon was in conjunction with Mars, which according to the almanac was to take place at midnight, or half an hour after, I found that when the moon rose to the horizon, an hour and a half after the sun had set, the planet had passed in that part of the east. I observed that the moon was about a degree and some minutes farther east than Mars, and at midnight she was 5 degrees and a half farther east, a little more or less, so that, making the proportion, if 24 hours are equal to 360 degrees, what are 5 hours and a half equal to? I found the result to be 82 degrees and a half, which was equal to my longitude from the meridian of the city of Cadiz, then giving to every degree 16 leagues and 2/3, which is 5,466 miles and 2/3. The reason why I give 16 leagues to each degree is because, according to Ptolomeo and Alfagrano, the earth turns 24,000 miles, which is equal to 6,000 leagues, which, being divided by 366 degrees, gives to each degree 16 leagues and 2/3. This calculation I certified many times, conjointly with the pilots, and found it true and good. It appears to me, most excellent Lorenzo, that by this voyage most of those philosophers are controverted who say that the torrid zone cannot be inhabited on account of the great heat. I have found the case to be quite the contrary. I have found that the air is fresher and more temperate in that region than beyond it, and that the inhabitants are also more numerous here than they are in other zones, for reasons which will be given below. Thus it is certain that practice is of more value than theory. Thus far I have related the navigation I accomplished in the south and west. It now remains for me to inform you of the appearance of the country we discovered, the nature of the inhabitants and their customs, the animals we saw, and of many other things worthy of remembrance which fell under my observation. After we turned our course to the north, the first land we found to be inhabited was an island at 10 degrees distance from the equinoctial line. When we arrived at it, we saw on the seashore a great many people, who stood looking at us with astonishment. We anchored within about a mile of the land, fitted out the boats, and 22 men, well armed, made for land. The people, when they saw us landing, and perceived that we were different from themselves, because they have no beard and wear no clothing of any description, being also of a different color, they being brown and we white, began to be afraid of us, and all ran into the woods. With great exertion, by means of signs, we reassured them and negotiated with them. We found that they were of a race called cannibals, the greater part or all of whom live on human flesh. Your Excellency may rest assured of this fact. They do not eat one another, but navigating with certain barks which they call canoes, they bring their prey from the neighboring islands or countries inhabited by those who are enemies, or of a different tribe from their own. They never eat any women unless they consider them outcasts. These things we verified in many places where we found similar people. We often saw the bones and heads of those who had been eaten, and they who had made the repast admitted the fact and said that their enemies always stood in much greater fear on that account. Still, they are a people of gentle disposition and a beautiful stature. They go entirely naked, and the arms which they carry are bows and arrows and shields. They are a people of great activity and much courage. They are very excellent marksmen. In fine, we held much intercourse with them, and they took us to one of their villages, about 2 leagues inland, and gave us our breakfast. They gave whatever we asked of them, though I think more through fear than affection, and after having been with them all one day, we returned to the ships, still remaining on friendly terms with them. We sailed along the coast of this island, and saw by the seashore another large village of the same tribe. We landed in the boats, and found they were waiting for us, all loaded with provisions, and they gave us enough to make a very good breakfast, according to their ideas of dishes. Seeing they were such kind people, and treated us so well, we dared not take anything from them, and made sail till we arrived at a gulf which is called the Gulf of Paria. We anchored opposite the mouth of the great river, which causes the water of this gulf to be fresh, and saw a large village close to the sea. We were surprised at the great number of people who were seen there. They were without arms, and seemed peaceably disposed. We went ashore with the boats, and they received us with great friendship, and took us to their houses, where they had made very good preparations for breakfast. Here they gave us 3 sorts of wine to drink, not of the juice of the grape, but made of fruits, like beer, and they were excellent. Here also we ate many fresh acorns, a most royal fruit. They gave us many other fruits, all different from ours, and of very good flavor, the flavor and odor of all being aromatic. They gave us some small pearls, and 11 large ones, and they told us by signs that if we would wait some days, they would go and fish for them and bring us many of them. We did not wish to be detained, so with many parrots of various colors and in good friendship, we parted from them. From these people we learned that those of the before-mentioned island were cannibals and ate human flesh. We issued from this gulf and sailed along the coast, seeing continually great numbers of people, and when we were so disposed, we treated with them, and they gave us everything we asked of them. They all go as naked as they were born, without being ashamed. If all were to be related concerning the little shame they have, it would be bordering on impropriety. Therefore, it is better to suppress it. After having sailed about 400 leagues continually along the coast, we concluded that this land was a continent, which might be bounded by the eastern parts of Asia, this being the commencement of the western part of the continent, because it happened often that we saw diverse animals, such as lions, stags, goats, wild hogs, rabbits, and other land animals which are not found in islands but only on the mainland. Going inland one day with 20 men, we saw a serpent, which was about 24 feet in length, and as large in girth as myself. We were very much afraid of it, and the sight of it caused us to return immediately to the sea. I oftentimes saw many ferocious animals and serpents. Thus, sailing along the coast, we discovered every day a great number of people speaking various languages. When we have navigated 400 leagues along the coast, we began to find people who did not wish for our friendship, but stood waiting for us with arms, which were bows and arrows, and with some other arms which they use. When we went to the shore in our boats, they disputed our landing in such a manner that we were obliged to fight with them. At the end of the battle, they found that they had the worst of it, for as they were naked, we always made great slaughter. Many times not more than 16 of us fought with 2,000 of them, and in the end defeated them, killing many and robbing their houses. One day we saw a great many people, all posted in battle array to prevent our landing. We fitted out 26 men, well armed, and covered the boats, on account of the arrows which were shot at us, and which always wounded some of us before we landed. After they had hindered us as long as they could, we leaped on shore and fought a hard battle with them. The reason why they had so much courage and fought with such great exertion against us was that they did not know what kind of weapon the sword was or how it cuts. While thus engaged in combat, so great was the multitude of people who charged upon us, throwing at us such a cloud of arrows, that we could not withstand the assault, and nearly abandoning the hope of life, we turned our backs and ran to the boats. While thus disheartened and flying, one of our sailors, a Portuguese man of 55 years of age, who had remained to guard the boat, seeing the danger we were in, jumped on shore and with a loud voice called out to us, "Children, turn your faces to your enemies, and God will give you the victory." Throwing himself on his knees, he made a prayer, and then rushed furiously upon the Indians, and we all joined with him, wounded as we were. On that, they turned their backs to us and began to flee, and finally we routed them and killed 150. We burned their houses also, at least 180 in number. Then, as we were badly wounded and weary, we returned to the ships. All went into a harbor to recruit, where we stayed 20 days, solely that the physician might cure us. All escaped except one, who was wounded in the left breast. After being cured, we recommenced our navigation, and through the same course we often were obliged to fight with a great many people, and always had the victory over them. Thus continuing our voyage, we came upon an island, 15 leagues distant from the mainland. As at our arrival we saw no collection of people, the island appearing favorably, we determined to attempt it, and 11 of us landed. We found a path in which we walked nearly 2 leagues inland, and came to a village of about 12 houses, in which there were only 7 women, who were so large that there was not one among them who was not a span and a half taller than myself. When they saw us, they were very much frightened, and the principal one among them, who was certainly a discreet woman, led us by signs into a house and had refreshments prepared for us. We saw such large women that were about determining to carry off 2 young ones about 15 years of age and make a present of them to their king, as they were, without doubt, creatures whose stature was above that of common men. While we were debating this subject, 36 men entered the house where we were drinking. They were of such large stature that each one was taller when upon his knees than when I was standing erect. In fact, they were of the stature of giants in their size and in the proportion of their bodies, which corresponded well with their height. Each of the women appeared a Penthesilea, and the men Ante. When they came in, some of our own number were so frightened that they did not consider themselves safe. They had bows and arrows, and very large clubs made in the form of swords. Seeing that we were of small stature, they began to converse with us, in order to learn who we were and from what parts we came. We gave them fair words, for the sake of peace, and said that we were going to see the world. Finally, we held it to be our wisest course to part from them without questioning in our turn. So returned by the same path in which we had come, they accompanying us quite to the sea, till we went on board the ships. Nearly half the trees of this island are dye wood, as good as that of the East. We went from this island to another in the vicinity at 10 leagues distance, and found a very large village, the houses of which were built over the sea like Venice, with much ingenuity. While we were struck with admiration at this circumstance, we determined to go and see them, and as we went into their houses, they attempted to prevent our entering. They found out at last the manner in which the sword cuts, and thought it best to let us enter. We found their houses filled with the finest cotton, and the beams of their dwellings were made of dye wood. We took a quantity of their cotton and some dye wood, and returned to the ships. Your Excellency must know that in all parts where we landed, we found a great quantity of cotton, and the country filled with cotton trees, so that all the vessels in the world might be loaded in these parts with cotton and dye wood. At length we sailed 300 leagues farther along the coast, constantly finding savage but brave people, and very often fighting with them and vanquishing them. We found 7 different languages among them, each of which was not understood by those who spoke the others. It is said that there are not more than 77 languages in the world, but I say there are more than 1,000, and there are more than 40 which I have heard myself. After having sailed along this coast 700 leagues or more, besides visiting numerous islands, our ships became greatly sea-worn and leaked badly, so that we could hardly keep them free with 2 pumps going. The men also were much fatigued, and the provisions growing short. We were then, according to the decision of the pilots, within 120 leagues of an island called Hispaniola, discovered by the Admiral Columbus 6 years before. We determined to proceed to it, and, as it was inhabited by Christians, to repair our ships there, allow the men a little repose, and recruit our stock of provisions. Because from this island to Castile there are 300 leagues of ocean without any land intervening. In 7 days we arrived at this island, where we stayed 2 months. Here we refitted our ships and obtained our supply of provisions. We afterward concluded to go to northern parts, where we discovered more than 1,000 islands, the greater part of them being inhabited. The people were without clothing, timid and ignorant, and we did whatever we wished to do with them. This last portion of our discoveries was very dangerous to our navigation on account of the shoals which we found thereabout. In several instances we came near being lost. We sailed in this sea 200 leagues directly north, until our people had become worn down with fatigue, through having been already nearly a year at sea. Their allowance was only 6 ounces of bread for eating, and but 3 small measures of water for drinking, per diem. And as the ships became dangerous to navigate with much longer, they remonstrated, saying that they wished to return to their homes in Castile, and not to tempt fortune and the sea any more. Whereupon we concluded to take some prisoners as slaves, and loading the ships with them, to return at once to Spain. Going therefore to certain islands, we possessed ourselves by force of 232, and steered our course for Castile. In 67 days we crossed the ocean and arrived at the islands of the Azores, which belong to the King of Portugal, and are 300 leagues distant from Cadiz. Here, having taken in our refreshments, we sailed for Castile. But the wind was contrary, and we were obliged to go to the Canary Islands, from there to the island of Madeira, and thence to Cadiz. We were absent 13 months on this voyage, exposing ourselves to awful dangers, and discovering a very large country of Asia and a great many islands, the largest part of them inhabited. According to the calculations I have several times made with the compass, we have sailed about 5,000 leagues. To conclude, we passed the equinoctial line 6½ degrees to the south, and afterward turned to the north, which we penetrated so far that the North Star was at an elevation of 35 degrees and a half above our horizon. To the west we sailed 84 degrees distant from the meridian of the city and port of Cadiz. We discovered immense regions, saw a vast number of people, all naked and speaking various languages. On the land we saw numerous wild animals, various kinds of birds, and an infinite number of trees, all aromatic. We brought home pearls in their growing state, and gold in the grain. We brought 2 stones, one of emerald color and the other of amethyst, which was very hard, and at least half a span long and 3 fingers thick. The sovereigns esteem them most highly, and have preserved them among their jewels. We brought also a piece of crystal, which some jewelers say is beryl. And according to what the Indians told us, they had a great quantity of the same. We brought 14 flesh-colored pearls, which the queen was highly delighted. We brought many other stones, which appeared beautiful to us. But of all these, we did not bring a large quantity, as we were continually busied in our navigation, and did not tarry long in any place. When we arrived at Cadiz, we sold many slaves, finding 200 remaining to us, the others completing the number of 232 having died at sea. After deducting the expense of transportation, we gained only about 500 ducats, which, having to be divided into 55 parts, made each share very small. However, we contented ourselves with life, and rendered thanks to God that during the whole voyage, out of 57 Christian men, which was our number, only 2 had died, they having been killed by Indians. I have had 2 quartan agues since my return, but I hope, by the favor of God, to be well soon, and they did not continue long now, and are without chills. I have passed over many things worthy of remembrance, in order not to be more tedious than I can help, all which are reserved for the pen and in the memory. They are fitting out 3 ships for me here, that I may go on a new voyage of discovery, and I think they will be ready by the middle of September. May it please our Lord to give me health and a good voyage, as I hope again to bring very great news and discover the island of Trapadana, which is between the Indian Ocean and the Sea of Ganges. Afterward I intend to return to my country and seek repose in the days of my old age. I have resolved, most excellent Lorenzo, that, as I have thus given you an account by letter of what has occurred to me, to send you 2 plans and descriptions of the world, made and arranged by my own hand skill. There will be a map on a plain surface, and the other a view of the world in spherical form, which I intend to send you by sea in the care of one Francesco Lati, a Florentine, who is here. I think you will be pleased with them, particularly with the globe, as I made one not long since for these sovereigns, and they esteem it highly. I could have wished to have come with them personally, but my new departure for making other discoveries will not allow me that pleasure. They are not wanting in your city persons who understand the figure of the world, and who may perhaps correct something in it. Nevertheless, whatever may be pointed out for me to correct, let them wait till I come, as it may be that I shall defend myself and prove my accuracy. I suppose your Excellency has learned the news brought by the fleet which the King of Portugal sent 2 years ago to make discoveries on the coast of Guinea. I do not call such a voyage as that one of discovery, but only a visit to discovered lands, because, as you will see by the map, their navigation was continually within sight of land, and they sailed around the whole southern part of Africa, which is proceeding by a way spoken of by all cosmographical authors. It is true that the navigation has been very profitable, which is a matter of great consideration in this kingdom, where ordinate covetousness reigns. I understand that they passed from the Red Sea and extended their voyage into the Persian Gulf to a city called Calicut, situated between the Persian Gulf and the river Indus. More lately, the King of Portugal has received from sea 12 ships, very richly laden, and he has sent them again to those ports, which they will certainly do a profitable business if they arrive safely. May our Lord preserve and increase the exalted state of your noble Excellency, as I desire. July 18th, 1500. Your Excellency's humble servant, Amerigo Vespucci. End of section 31.
Section 32 of the Great Events by Famous Historians. Volume 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Michelle Kinge, Surrey, United Kingdom. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 8, edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Section 32. Rise and Fall of the Borgias, A.D. 1502, by Niccolo Machiavelli. The commencement of the 16th century found Italy suffering from the foreign interference of France and Spain. The chief Italian states at this period were the Kingdom of Naples, the Papal States, the Duchy of Milan, and the republics of Venice, Florence, and Genoa. Ferdinand V of Aragon and Louis XII of France, who had hereditary claims through his grandmother Valentino Visconti, had concluded a secret and perfidious treaty for the partition of the Kingdom of Naples, the effects of which Frederick II, the King, vainly sought to avert. They conquered Naples in 1501, but disagreed over the division of the spoil, and the French army being defeated by the Spanish on the Garigliano in 1503, Spanish influence soon after became dominant in Italy. In the march of the French army on Naples in 1501, the French commander had for lieutenant Caesar Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI, whose career furnishes a vivid illustration of the internal conditions of Italy at this period. Borgia, who had resigned from the cardinalate conferred on him by his father, had been created Duke of Valentinois by the King of France, had married the daughter of the King of Navarre, and was invested with the Duchy of Romagna by his father in 1501. By force and treachery he reduced the cities of Romagna, which were ruled by feudatories of the Papal See, and, with the assistance of his relations, endeavoured to found an independent hereditary power in central Italy. The contemporaneous account of these events by the celebrated Niccolo Machiavelli possesses a fascinating interest, which is greatly enhanced by the fact that Machiavelli himself was a participant in the events of which he writes. A Florentine by birth, Machiavelli was sent by his fellow citizens in 1502 on a mission to Borgia, who had just returned from a visit to the King of France in Lombardy. During Borgia's absence, friends and former colleagues, alarmed at his ambition and cruelty, had entered into a league with his enemies and invited the Florentines to join them. The Florentines refused, but sent Machiavelli to make professions of friendship and offers of assistance to the Duke, and at the same time to watch his movements, to discover his real intentions, and endeavour to obtain something in return for their friendship. Borgia, who had the reputation of being the closest man of his age, had to deal with a negotiator who, though young, was a match for him, and the account of the mission is very curious. There was deep dissimulation on both sides. Machiavelli returned to Florence in January 1503 after 3 eventful months passed in the court and camp of Borgia. The treatise, The Prince, has been described as a display of cool, judicious, scientific atrocity on the part of Caesar Borgia, Duke Valentino, which seemed rather to belong to a fiend than to the most depraved of men. Principles which the most hardened ruffian would scarcely hint to his most trusted accomplice, or avow without the disguise of some palliating sophism even to his own mind, are professed without the slightest circumlocution and assumed as the fundamental axioms of all political science. On being reproved for the maxims contained in the work, Machiavelli replied, "If I taught princes how to tyrannize, I also taught the people how to destroy them." And in these words, posterity has vindicated the reputation of the talented Italian statesman and author. Those who, from a private station, have ascended to the dignity of princes by the favour of fortune alone, meet with few difficulties in their progress, but encounter many in maintaining themselves on the throne. Obstructed by no impediments during their journey, they soar to a great height, but all the difficulties arise after they are quietly seated. These princes are chiefly such as acquire their dominions by money or by favour. Such were the men whom Darius placed in Greece, in the cities of Ionia and of the Hellespont, whom for their own security and glory he raised to the rank of sovereigns. Such were the emperors who from a private station arrived at the empire by corrupting the soldiery. They sustained their elevation only by the pleasure and fortune of those who advanced them, two foundations equally uncertain and insecure. They had neither the experience nor the power necessary to maintain their position, for unless men possess superior genius or courage, how can they know in what manner to govern others who have themselves always been accustomed to a private station? Deficient in knowledge, they will be equally destitute of power for want of troops on whose attachment and fidelity they can depend. Besides, those states which have suddenly risen, like other things in nature of premature and rapid growth, do not take sufficient root in the minds of men, but they must fall with the first stroke of adversity, unless the princes themselves, so unexpectedly exalted, possess such superior talents that they can discover at once the means of preserving their good fortune, and afterward maintain it by having recourse to the same measures which others had adopted before them. To adduce instances of supreme power attained by good fortune and superior talent, I may refer to two examples which have happened in our own time, viz. Francis Sforza and Caesar Borgia. The former, by lawful means, and by his great abilities, raised himself from a private station to the dukedom of Milan, and maintained with but little difficulty what had cost him so much trouble to acquire. Caesar Borgia, Duke of Valentinois, commonly called the Duke of Valentino, on the other hand, attained a sovereignty by the good fortune of his father, which he lost soon after his father's decease, though he exerted his utmost endeavours, and employed every means that skill or prudence could suggest, to retain those states which he had acquired by the arms and good fortune of another. For though a good foundation may not have been laid before a man arrives at dominion, it may possibly be accomplished afterward by a ruler of superior mind. Yet this can only be effected with much difficulty to the architect and danger to the edifice. If therefore we examine the whole conduct of Borgia, we shall see how firm a foundation he had laid for future greatness. This examination will not be superfluous, for I know no better lesson for the instruction of a prince than is afforded by the actions and example of the Duke. For, if the measures he adopted did not succeed, it was not his fault, but rather owing to the extreme perversity of fortune. Pope Alexander VI, wishing to give his son a sovereignty in Italy, had not only present but future difficulties to contend with. In the first place, he saw no means of making him sovereign of any state independent of the Church, and if he should endeavour to dismember the ecclesiastical state, he knew that the Duke of Milan and the Venetians would never consent to it, because Faenza and Rimini were already under the protection of the latter, and the armies of Italy, from whom he might expect material service, were in the hands of those who had the most reason to apprehend the aggrandizement of the papal power, such as the Orsini, the Colonni, and their partisans. It was consequently necessary to dissolve these connections and to throw the Italian states into confusion in order to secure the sovereignty of a part. This was easy to accomplish. The Venetians, influenced by motives of their own, had determined to invite the French into Italy. The Pope made no opposition to their design. He even favoured it by consenting to annul the first marriage of Louis XII, who therefore marched into Italy with the aid of the Venetians and the consent of Alexander. He was no sooner at Milan than the Pope availed himself of his assistance to overrun Romagna, which he acquired by the reputation of his alliance with the King of France. The Duke, having thus acquired Romagna and weakened the colony, wished at the same time to preserve and increase his own principality. But there were two obstacles in his way. The first arose from his own people, upon whom he could not depend. The other from the designs of the French. He feared that Orsini, of whose aid he had availed himself, might fail at the critical moment, and not only prevent his further acquisitions, but even deprive him of those he had made. And he had reason to apprehend the same conduct on the part of France, and was convinced of the trifling reliance he could place on the Orsini. For after the reduction of Faenza, when he made the attack on Bologna, they manifested an evident want of activity. As to the king, his intentions were easily discerned, for when he had conquered the Duchy of Urbino and was about to make an irruption into Tuscany, the king obliged him to desist from the enterprise. The Duke determined, therefore, neither to depend on fortune nor on the arms of another prince. He began by weakening the party of the Orsini and the Colonni at Rome, by corrupting all the persons of distinction who adhered to them, either by bribes, appointments, or commands suited to their respective qualities, so that in a few months a complete revolution was effected in their attachment, and they all came over to the Duke. Having thus humbled the colony, he only waited an opportunity for destroying the Orsini. It was not long before one offered, of which he did not fail to avail himself. The Orsini, perceiving too late that the power of the Duke and the Church must be established upon their ruin, called a council of their friends at Maginot in Perugia to concert measures of prevention. The consequence of their deliberations was the revolt of Urbino. The disturbances of Romagna and the infinite dangers which threatened the Duke on every side, and which he finally surmounted by the aid of the French. His affairs once re-established, he grew weary of relying on France and other foreign allies, and he resolved for the future to rely alone on artifice and dissimulation, a course in which he so well succeeded that the Orsini were reconciled to him through the intervention of Signor Pelio, whom he had gained over to his interests by all manner of rich presents and friendly offices. and this man, being deceived himself, so far prevailed on the credulity of the rest that they attended the Duke at an interview at Sinigalia, where they were all put to death. Having thus exterminated the chiefs and converted their partisans into his friends, the Duke laid the solid foundations of his power. He made himself master of all Romagna and the Duchy of Urbino, and gained the affection of the inhabitants, particularly the former, by giving them a prospect of the advantages they might hope to enjoy from his government. As this latter circumstance is remarkable and worthy of imitation, I cannot suffer it to pass unnoticed. After the Duke had possessed himself of Romagna, he found it had been governed by a number of petty princes, more addicted to the spoliation than the government of their subjects, and whose political weakness rather served to create popular disturbances than to secure the blessings of peace. The country was infested with robbers, torn by factions, and a prey to all the horrors of civil commotions. He found that, to establish tranquillity, order, and obedience, a vigorous government was necessary. With this view he appointed Ramiro d'Orco governor, a cruel but active man, to whom he gave the greatest latitude of power. He very soon appeased the disturbances, united all the parties, and acquired the renown of restoring the whole country to peace. The Duke soon deemed it no longer necessary to continue so rigorous and odious a system. He therefore erected in the midst of the province a court of civil judicature, with a worthy and upright magistrate to preside over it, where every city had its respective advocate. He was aware that the severities of Ramiro had excited some hatred against him, and resolved to clear himself from all reproach in the minds of the people, and to gain their affection by showing them that the cruelties which had been committed did not originate with him, but solely in the ferocious disposition of his minister. Taking advantage of the discontent, he caused Ramiro to be massacred one morning in the marketplace, and his body exposed upon a gibbet, with a cutlass near it stained with blood. The horror of this spectacle satisfied the resentment of the people, and petrified them at once with terror and astonishment. The Duke had now delivered himself in a great measure from present enemies, and taken effectual means to secure himself by employing against them arms of his own, putting it out of the power of his neighbours to annoy him. To secure and increase his acquisitions, he had nothing to fear from anyone but the French. He well knew that the King of France, who at last perceived his error, would oppose his further aggrandizement. He resolved in the first place to form new connections and alliances, and adopted a system of prevarication with France, as plainly appeared when their army was employed in Naples against the Spaniards, who had laid siege to Gaeta. His design was to fortify himself against them. He would certainly have succeeded if Alexander VI had lived a little longer. Such were the methods he took to guard against present dangers. Against those which were more remote, as he had reason to fear that the new Pope would be inimical to him, and seek to deprive him of what had been bestowed on him by his predecessor, he designed to have made 4 different provisions. In the first place, by utterly destroying the families of all those nobles whom he had deprived of their states, so that the future Pope might not re-establish them. Secondly, by attaching to his interests all the gentry of Rome, in order by their means to control the power of the Pope. Thirdly, by securing a majority in the College of Cardinals. Fourthly and lastly, by acquiring so much power during the lifetime of his father that he might be enabled of himself to resist the first attack of the enemy. 3 of these designs he had effected before the death of Alexander, and had made every necessary arrangement for availing himself of the 4th. He had put to death almost all the nobles whom he had despoiled, and had gained over all the Roman gentry. His party was the strongest in the College of Cardinals, and for a further augmentation of his power, he designed to have made himself master of Tuscany. He was already master of Perugia and Piombino, and had taken Pisa under his protection, of which he soon afterward took actual possession. His cautious policy with regard to the French was no longer necessary, as they had been driven from the kingdom of Naples by the Spaniards, and both of these people were under the necessity of courting his friendship. Lucca and Siena presently submitted to him, either from fear or hatred of the Florentines. The latter were then unable to defend themselves, and if this had been the case at the time of Alexander's death, the Duke's power and reputation would have been so great that he might have sustained his dignity without any dependence on fortune or the support of others. Alexander VI died 5 years after he had first unsheathed his sword. He left his son nothing firmly established but the single state of Romagna. All his other conquests were absolutely visionary, as he was not only enclosed between 2 hostile and powerful armies, but was himself attacked by a mortal disease. The Duke, however, possessed so much ability and courage, was so well acquainted with the arts, either of gaining or ruining others as it suited his purpose, and so strong were the foundations he had laid in that short space of time, that if he had either been in health or not distressed by those 2 hostile armies, he would have surmounted every difficulty. As a proof of the soundness of the foundation he had laid, Romagna continued faithful to him, and was firm to his interest for above a month afterward. Although Baglioni, the Vitelli, and the Orsini all came to Rome at that time, yet, half dead as he was, they feared to attempt anything against him. If he could not elect a pope of his own choice, he was at least able to prevent the election of one unfriendly to his interests. If he had been in health when Alexander died, he would have succeeded in all his designs. For he said, the very day that Julius II was elected, that he had foreseen every obstacle which could arise on the death of his father, and had prepared adequate remedies, but that he could not foresee that at the time of his father's death his own life would be in such imminent hazard. Upon a thorough review of the Duke's conduct and actions, I cannot reproach him with having omitted any precaution, and I feel that he merits being proposed as a model to all who by fortune or foreign arms succeed in acquiring sovereignty. For as he had a great spirit and vast designs, he could not have acted otherwise in his circumstances, and if he miscarried in them, it was solely owing to the sudden death of his father, and the illness with which he himself attacked. Whoever therefore would secure himself in a new principality against the attempts of the enemies, and find it necessary to gain friends, to surmount obstacles by force of cunning, to make himself beloved and feared by the people, respected and obeyed by the soldiery, to destroy all those who can or may oppose his designs, to promulgate new laws in substitution of old ones, to be severe, indulgent, magnanimous, and liberal, to disband an army on which he cannot rely, and raise another in its stead, to preserve the friendship of kings and princes, so that they may be ever prompt to oblige and fearful to offend, Such a one, I say, cannot have a better or more recent model for his imitation than is afforded by the conduct of Borgia. One thing blamable in his actions occurred on the election of Julius II to the pontificate. He could not nominate the prelate in whom he wished, but he had it in his power to exclude anyone whom he disliked. He ought therefore never to have consented to the election of one of those cardinals whom he had formerly injured, and who might have reason to fear him after his election. For mankind injures others from motives either of hatred or fear. Among others whom he had injured were St. Peter ad Vincula Colonna, St. George, and Ascanius. All the other candidates for the pontificate had cause to fear him except the Cardinal of Rouen and the Spanish cardinals. The latter were united to him by family connections, and the Cardinal d'Amboise, who was too powerfully supported by France to have reason to fear him. The Duke ought by all means to have procured the election of a Spaniard, or in case of failure should have consented to the proposal of the Archbishop of Rouen, but on no account to the nomination St. Peter ad Vincula. It is an error to think that new obligations will extinguish the memory of former injuries in the minds of great men. The Duke therefore in this election committed a fault which proved the occasion of his utter ruin. End of section 32.
Section 33 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jake Malizia. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 8. Edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Painting of the Sistine Chapel. The Splendor of Renaissance Art under Michelangelo. AD 1508. Charles Clement. In the history of the Renaissance, the revival of art adds a new glory to that of letters, and among the masters of that revival there is none greater than Michelangelo Buonarroti, sculptor, painter, architect, poet, and heroic man. He was descended from an ancient but not distinguished Florentine family, and was born at Caprese, Italy, March 6, 1475. In 1488 he was apprenticed to the painter Ghirlandaio. He studied antique marbles in the garden of San Marco, where he was discovered by Lorenzo de' Medici, who in 1489 took him into his palace. There the young student remained until his patron's death, 1492, improving the great opportunities presented to him. The Mask of a Faun was sculptured during this time. Before the expulsion of the Medici, he went to Bologna, and there executed several works. Returning to Florence in 1495, he was called next year to Rome, where he lived till 1501, producing works which displayed his extraordinary genius, the most important of them being the Pietà di San Pietro, 1498. Again returning to Florence, he carved his first David from an immense block of Carrara marble. In 1505 he was summoned again to Rome by Pope Julius II to design his tomb, and this work occupied Michelangelo from time to time throughout the remainder of his life. He was forced, probably through the intrigues of Bramante, his rival in architecture, to leave Rome, and once more, 1506, returned to Florence. In the intervals between all these dates, he produced many of his masterpieces. From this period, the historian follows Michelangelo through an important stage of his active career, showing how the hand that rounded Peter's dome and created so many other of the greatest works of art toiled on with patient heroism in spite of hindrances almost incredible. The painting of the Sistine Chapel, upon which his fame so largely rests, is here described in language that reveals the manhood no less clearly than the artistic genius of Michelangelo. In 1508, Michelangelo returned to Rome and resumed his labours on the mausoleum. He had soon again to abandon them. Bramante had persuaded the Pope that it was unlucky to have his tomb erected, but advised him to employ Michelangelo in painting the chapel built by his uncle Sixtus IV. It was, in effect, in the beginning of this year that he commenced this gigantic decoration, which was destined to be his most splendid work. We shall see the resistance he first opposed to Julius's desire, and the ardour with which he undertook, and the rapidity with which he accomplished the work, once he made up his mind to accept it. But first, since at the period we have come to, most of the statues which now adorn the tomb of Julius II at San Pietro in Vinculo, and those more numerous that belonged to the original project, but which have been dispersed, were blocked out or finished, I wish to give, in order not to return to the subject, a general idea of this monument, to show what, from reduction to reduction, the original design has become, and what annoyances it occasioned its author. The original magnificent design remained unmodified until 1513, but on Julius's death, his testamentary executors, the Cardinals Santiquattro and Aginense, and the Duke of Urbino, reduced to 6 the number of statues that were to form the decoration, and reduced from 10,000 to 6,000 ducats the sum to be employed on it. From 1513 to 1521, Leo X, who cared less to complete his predecessor's monument than to endow his native city, Florence, with the works of the great artist, employed Michelangelo almost exclusively in building the façade and sacristy of San Lorenzo. During the short, austere pontificate of Adrian VI, Michelangelo again devoted himself to the sculptures of the monument, but under Clement VII, he had again to abandon them in order to execute in Florence the projects of Leo X, which the new pope had adopted. Toward 1531, the Duke of Urbino at last obtained permission for Michelangelo to suspend the works at San Lorenzo in order to finish the tomb so long since begun. Nevertheless, it does not appear that he was allowed much time to devote to it. At last, on the death of Clement VII, he thought he had regained his liberty, and could, after such long involuntary delay, fulfil his engagements. But hardly was Paul III installed than he sent for him, gave him the most cordial reception, and begged him to consecrate his talents to his service. Michelangelo replied that it was impossible. He was bound by treaty to terminate the mausoleum of Julius II. Paul flew into a rage and said, 30 years have I desired this, and now that I am Pope I am not to be allowed to satisfy it. I shall tear up this contract. I mean that you shall obey me. The Duke of Urbino loudly complained, openly accusing Michelangelo of want of good faith. The sculptor, not knowing which way to turn, besought the Pope to allow him to complete the work he was pledged to. He formed the wildest projects in order to escape the amicable compulsion of Paul, among others that of retiring to Carrara, where he had passed some tranquil years among the mountains of marble. The pontiff, to put an end to all these discussions, issued a brief dated September 18th, 1537, wherein he declared Michelangelo, his heirs and successors, released from all obligations resulting from the different contracts entered into on the subject of the monument. This fashion of terminating things could not satisfy the Duke of Urbino, nor relieve Michelangelo. The negotiations were again resumed, and it ended in their agreement that the monument should be raised in the form in which we now see it in the church of San Pietro in Vinculo, and should be composed of the statue of Moses, executed entirely by the hand of Michelangelo, of 2 figures personifying active life and contemplative life, which were already much advanced, but were to be finished by Raffaello de Montelupo. Of 2 other statues by his master, a Madonna after a model by Michelangelo, and the figure of Julius by Maso del Bosco. Such is the very abridged history of this monument, which was not entirely completed till 1550, after having caused for nearly half a century real torment to Buonarroti. The Duke of Urbino was not satisfied, neither was Michelangelo. The figures, originally intended to form part of a colossal whole under the great roof of St. Peter's, appeared too large for the place they now occupy. The importance of the statue of Moses misleads the mind, suggesting the idea that the monument itself is raised to the memory of the Hebrew legislator, rather than to that of the warrior pope. At all events, in this statue is centered the principal, we may say the unique, interest of the tomb. This prodigious work must be in the memory of all. Amid the masterpieces of ancient and modern sculpture, the Moses remains ever unparalleled, a type, not irreproachable, but the most striking of a new art. I do not speak of the consummate science which Michelangelo displays in the modelling of this statue. The Greeks were learned in another fashion, but were so equally with him. Whence comes it, nevertheless, that in spite of bizarreries needless to defend or to deny, and although this austere figure is far from attaining or pretending to the serene and tranquil beauty which the ancients regarded as the supreme term of art, whence is it that it produces upon the most prejudiced mind an irresistible impression? It is that it is more than human, that it lifts the soul into a world of feelings and ideas of which the ancients knew less than we do. Their voluptuous art, in deifying the human form, held down thought to earth. The Moses of Michelangelo beheld God, heard that voice of thunder, and bears the terrible impress of what he saw and heard on Mount Sinai. His profound eye is scrutinizing the mysteries he vaguely sees in his prophetic dreams. Is it the Moses of the Bible? I cannot say. Is it in this way Praxiteles and Phidias would have represented Lycurgus and Solon? We may deny it boldly. The legislators in their hands would have been the embodiment of law. They would have represented an abstraction in a form whose harmonious beauty nothing can alter. Moses is not merely the legislator of a people. Not thought alone dwells beneath this powerful brow. He feels, he suffers, he lives in a moral world which Jehovah has opened to him, and, although above humanity, is a man. On his return to Rome in 1508, Michelangelo had found Julius II not cooled toward him, but preoccupied by new projects. The Pope made no allusion to his monument, and was absorbed in the reconstruction of St. Peter's, which he had confided to Bramante. Raphael was beginning at the same time the frescoes of the Stanza della Segnatura, and 2 biographers of Michelangelo, whose testimony, it is true on this point may be suspected, agree in saying that the architect of St. Peter's, jealous of the superiority of the Florentine sculptor, fearing lest he should discover the mistakes committed in his recent constructions, and the malversations of which perhaps he was not innocent, advised the Pope to confide to him the painting of the ceiling of the chapel built by Sixtus IV, hoping to compromise and ruin him by engaging him in works of which he had no experience. Julius adopted the idea, sent for Michelangelo, and ordered him to begin forthwith. Buonarroti had had no practice in fresco painting since his student days under Ghirlandaio. He knew that the painting of a ceiling was not an easy matter. He pleaded every excuse, proposed that the commission should be given to Raphael, saying that for his part, being but a sculptor, he could not succeed. The Pope was inflexible, and Michelangelo began the ceiling on May 10th, 1508, the most prodigious monument, perhaps, that ever sprang from the human mind. Julius had ordered Bramante to construct the necessary scaffoldings, but the latter did it in so inefficient a manner that Michelangelo was obliged to dispense with his assistance and construct the whole machinery himself. He had sent for some of his fellow students from Florence, not, as Vasari by some strange aberration states, because he was ignorant of fresco painting, since all the artists of the time understood it, and the pupil of Ghirlandaio had himself practiced it, but because his fellow students had had more experience in it, and he wished to be helped in a work of this importance. He was, however, so dissatisfied with their work that he effaced all that they did, and without any assistance, if we are to believe his biographer, even grinding his own colours, he shut himself up in the chapel, beginning at dawn, quitting at nightfall, often sleeping in his clothes on the scaffolding, allowing himself but a slight repast at the end of the day, and letting no one see the works he had begun. Hardly had he set to work when unforeseen difficulties presented themselves, which were on the point of making him relinquish the whole thing. The colours, while still fresh, were covered with a mist, the cause of which he was unable to discover. Utterly discouraged, he went to the Pope and said, "I forewarned your Holiness that painting was not my art. All I have done is lost, and if you do not believe me, order someone to come and see it." Julius sent San Gallo, who saw that the accident was caused by the quality of the time, and that Michelangelo had made his plaster too wet. Buonarroti after this proceeded with the utmost ardour, and in the space of 20 months, without further accident, finished the first half. The mystery with which Michelangelo surrounded himself keenly excited public curiosity. In spite of the painter's objection, Julius frequently visited him in the chapel, and, notwithstanding his great age, ascended the ladder, Michelangelo extending a hand that he might with safety reach the platform. He grew impatient. He was eager that all Rome should share his admiration. It was in vain that Michelangelo objected that all the machinery would have to be reconstructed, that half the ceiling was not completed. The Pope would listen to nothing, and the chapel was accordingly opened to the public on the morning of November 1st, 1509. Julius was the first to arrive before the dust occasioned by the taking down of the scaffolding was laid, and celebrated Mass there the same day. The success was immense. Bramante, seeing that his evil intentions, far from succeeding, had only served to add to the glory of Michelangelo, who had come triumphant out of the trap he had laid for him, besought the Pope to permit Raphael to paint the other half of the chapel. Notwithstanding the affection he bore his architect, Julius adhered to his resolution, and Michelangelo resumed, after a brief interruption, the painting of the ceiling. But rumours of these cabals reached him. They troubled him, and he complained to the Pope of Bramante's conduct. It is probable that the coolness which always existed between Raphael and Michelangelo dates from this period. The second part of the ceiling, by much the most considerable, was finished in 1512. It is difficult to explain how Vasari, confusing the dates, and appearing to apply to the whole what referred only to the first part, could have stated that this immense work was completed in the space of 20 months. If anything could astonish, it is that Michelangelo was able in 4 years to accomplish so gigantic a work. It is needless, for the purpose of exciting our admiration, to endeavour to persuade us that it was done in a space of time materially insufficient. Such was the impatience of Julius, that again he nearly quarrelled with Michelangelo. The latter, requiring to go to Florence on business, went to the Pope for money. "When do you mean to finish my chapel?" said the Pope. "As soon as I can," answered Michelangelo. "As soon as I can, as soon as I can," replied the irascible pontiff. "I'll have you flung off your scaffoldings." And he touched him with his stick. Michelangelo went home, set his affairs in order, and was on the point of leaving when the Pope sent him his favourite Accurcio, with his apology and 500 ducats. This time again Michelangelo was unable to finish his work as completely as he would have wished. He desired to retouch certain portions, but seeing the inconvenience of re-erecting the scaffoldings, he determined to do nothing more, saying that what was wanting to his figures was not of importance. "You should put a little gold on them," said the Pope. "My chapel will look very poor." "The people I have painted there," answered Michelangelo, "were poor." Accordingly, nothing was changed. These paintings on the ceiling of the Sistine transcend all description. How give an idea of these countless sublime figures to those who have not trembled and turned pale in this awful temple? The immense superiority of Michelangelo is manifest in this chapel itself, where are paintings of Ghirlandaio, of Signorelli, which pale near those of Florentine as the light of a lamp does in the light of the sun. Raphael painted about the same time, and under the influence of what he had seen in the Sistine, his admirable Sibyls of the Pace. But compare them! He also no doubt attained in some of his works the St. Paul of the cartoon, the Vision of Ezekiel, the Virgin of the Dresden Museum, the summit of sublime art, but that which is the exception with Sanzio is the rule with the great Buonarroti. Michelangelo lived in a superhuman world, and his daring, unexpected conceptions are so beyond and outside the habitual thoughts of men that they repel by their very elevation, and are far from fascinating all minds as do the wonderful and charming creations of the painter of Urbino. It is necessary, however, to combat the widespread opinion that Michelangelo understood only the extreme feelings, and could express these only by violent and exaggerated movements. All agree that his figures possess the highest qualities of art: invention, sublimity of style, breadth and science in the drawing, appropriateness and fitness of colour, and this character so striking in the ceiling of the Sistine that it is not of the painter that the paintings make you think, that looking at it you say to yourself, "This tragic heaven must have come thus, all peopled with its gigantic forms." And it is by an effort of the mind only we are brought to think of the creator of this sublime work. But it is denied that he understood grace, young and innocent beauty, the forms which express the tender and delicate feelings, those which the divine pencil of Raphael so admirably represented. I own that he took little heed of the pleasurable aspect of things. His austere genius was at ease only in grave thoughts, but I do not agree that he was always a stranger to gentle beauty, to feminine beauty in particular. I shall not cite the Virgin of the London Academy, nor in another order the admirable Captive of the Louvre Museum, but without quitting the Sistine, could we dream of anything more marvellously beautiful than his Adam awaking for the first time to light, or more chaste, more graceful, more touching than his young Eve leaning toward her Creator, and breathing in through her half-opened lips the divine breath that is giving her life? What is the meaning of this terrible work? What means this long evolution of human destiny? Why did these two things that we see beautiful and happy in the beginning, why did they people the earth with this ardent, restless, at once gigantic and powerless race? Ah, Greece would have made this ceiling an Olympus, inhabited by happy and divine men. Michelangelo put there great unhappy beings, and this painful poem of humanity is truer than the wondrous fictions of ancient poetry and art. Michelangelo, says Condivi, especially admired Dante. He also devoted himself earnestly to the reading of the scriptures and the writings of Savonarola, for whom he had always great affection, having preserved in his mind the memory of his powerful voice. Besides, the country of the great Florentine, the glorious Italy of the Renaissance, was in a state of dissolution. Such studies, such reminiscences, such and so sad realities may explain the visions that passed through the mind of the great artist during the 4 years of almost complete solitude he passed in the Sistine. The precise meaning of these compositions will probably never be known, but so long as men exist they will, as in the object of art, attract minds toward the dim world of the ideal. The year that followed the opening of the Sistine, and which preceded the death of Julius, appears, as do the first two of Leo X's pontificate, to have been the happiest and calmest of Michelangelo's life. The old pope loved him, showed him, says Condivi, attentions he showed no other of those who approached him. He honoured his probity, and even that independence of character of which he himself had more than once had experience. Michelangelo, on his side, forgave him his frequent outbursts of impetuosity that were ever atoned for by prompt and complete acknowledgment. Michelangelo's sight, greatly enfeebled by this persistent work for 4 years, compelled him to take almost absolute repose. The necessity he was under, says Vasari, during this period of work, of keeping his eyes turned upward, had so weakened his sight that for several months after he could not look at a drawing, nor read a letter without raising it above his head. He enjoyed an uncontested glory in this interval of semi-repose which followed his great effort. It is probable that his thoughts were now concentrated upon the sepulchral monument of his patron, the works for which he had been forced to postpone. But Leo X had other views. He was all-powerful in Florence, where by the aid of Julius and the League of Cambrai, he had reinstated his family in 1512. He now wished to endow his native city with monuments, which, by recalling to the vanquished citizens of this glorious republic the magnificence of their early patrons, might help them to forget the institutions they had lost for the second time. The church of San Lorenzo, built by Brunelleschi, where several members of his family were buried, had not been completed. He now determined to have the facade constructed. Several artists, among others San Gallo, the two Sansovino, and Raphael, sent in plans for this important work, but Michelangelo's was preferred, and in 1515 he went to Carrara to order the necessary marbles. Leo did not leave him there long in quiet, being informed that at Sarayezza, in the highest part of the mountains of Pietrasanta, on the Florentine territory, there was a marble equal in quality to that of Carrara. He ordered Michelangelo to go to Pietrasanta and work these quarries. In vain the latter pointed out the enormous expense of opening them, of cutting roads through the mountains, and making the marshes passable, besides the inferior quality of the marble. Leo would not listen. Michelangelo set out, made the roads, raised the marbles, remained from 1516 to 1521 in this desert, and the 4 years he passed there, in the full force of his age and genius, resulted in the transport of 5 columns, 4 of which remained on the seashore, and the 5th of which lies still useless and buried among the rubbish of the piazza of San Lorenzo. Without meaning to contest the debt which the arts owe Leo X, there are certain reservations that we must make on this score. A man of letters, of amiable manners, astute, somewhat of a mischief-maker, ever fluctuating between France and the Emperor, ever on the watch to provide for his family, and to redeem these defects, having neither heroism nor the undoubted though mistaken love that Julius II brought to Italy, his political career cannot, I think, be defended. He had the merit of being the patron of Raphael, whose facile, flexible character pleased him, and who, thanks to his protection, marked every instant of his short life by some chef-d'œuvre. It must not be forgotten that it was by the most extravagant largesses, by making a traffic of everything, that he encouraged the pleiad of artists who shed such glory upon his name. His obstinacy in employing Michelangelo for so many years, in spite of his reluctance and entreaties, on a work which his own fickleness and the war in Lombardy ought to have made him abandon, has, there can be no doubt, deprived us of some admirable works. But for it, Michelangelo would have finished the tomb of Julius II, and we should now possess a gigantic monument that would no doubt have rivaled the grandest works of ancient statuary. A few words of Condivi's show the grief and discouragement which the capriciousness of Leo and the inutility of the work the master was employed on caused Michelangelo. On his return to Florence, he found Leo's ardour entirely cooled. He continued a long time weighed down by grief, unable to do anything, having hitherto, to his great displeasure, been driven from one project to another. It was, however, about this period, 1520, that Leo ordered the tombs of his brother Giuliano and his nephew Lorenzo for the sacristy of the church of San Lorenzo, which were not executed till 10 years later. Also plans for the library for the reception of the valuable manuscripts collected from Cosmo and Lorenzo the Magnificent, and which had been dispersed during the troubles of 1494. He was at Florence when the Academy of Santa Maria Novella, of which he was a member, proposed to have transported from Ravenna to Florence the ashes of Dante, and addressed the noble supplication to the Pope, which had been preserved by Gore, signed by the most illustrious names of the time, and, among others, that of Michelangelo, with this addition: I, Michelangelo, sculptor, also beseech your holiness, and offer myself to execute a suitable monument for the divine poet in some fitting part of the city. Leo did not receive this project favourably, and it was abandoned. The statue, the Christ on the Cross, that had been ordered by Antonio Matelli, which is now in the church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, was, it is probable, executed during Michelangelo's rare visits to Rome under Leo's pontificate. His discouragement had become such that he had it finished and put up at the end of 1521 by a Florentine sculptor of the name of Federigo Frizzi. The statue of Christ, one of the most finished and displaying most knowledge, that issued from the hands of Michelangelo, is far to my mind from equalling other works of the great sculptor. Yet it was the rapidly acquired celebrity of the work, terminated by Federigo Frizzi, that decided Francis I on sending Primaticcio to Italy, commissioning him to make a cast of the Christ of the Minerva, and to ask Michelangelo to execute a statue for him, also to deliver to him the flattering letter preserved in the valuable collection at Lille. Leo X died on December 1st, 1521, a year after Raphael. His successor, the humble and austere Adrian VI, knew nothing about pictures except those of Van Eyck and Albert Dürer. His simple manners formed a striking contrast to the ostentatious habits of Leo. During his pontificate, all the great works were stopped at Rome and slackened at Florence. While Michelangelo was obscurely working at the library of San Lorenzo, the great age of art was drawing to its close. Raphael and Leonardo were dead, and their pupils were already hurrying on to a rapid decadence. Characters were beginning to decline at the same time that talent did, and Michelangelo, who, as it were, opened this grand era, was destined to survive alone, like those lofty summits that first received the morning light, and which are still lit up, while all around has grown obscure, and night is already profound. End of section 33.
Section 34 of the Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Piotr. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 8, edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Balboa discovers the Pacific, A.D. 1513, by Manuel José Quintana. Vasco Núñez de Balboa, the Spanish soldier and discoverer of the Pacific Ocean, was born in 1475 and died near Darien, the scene of his principal achievement, probably in 1517. Unfairly charged with conspiracy, after rendering great services to his country, he was beheaded just as he was completing preparations to explore the South Sea, as he named the ocean which he had discovered. He first went to Darien from Hispaniola, Haiti, in 1510, promoted a settlement, and was made its alcalde. In 1512, Pasamonte, king's treasurer at Santo Domingo, commissioned him as governor. Balboa undertook many explorations, and was usually on friendly terms with the Indians, who told him of a great sea lying to the south, and of a country, Peru, rich in gold, far down the coast. He set out from Darien, September 1st, 1513, to discover the great sea and the country of which he thus heard. He had conquered the Indian king Careta, whose friendship he gained, and whose daughter he married. He went by sea to his father-in-law's territory, and taking with him some of the king's Indians, he moved into the territory of the cacique Ponca, an enemy of Careta. Quintana, whose account follows, is the favourite historian of this expedition. His Lives of Celebrated Spaniards is regarded as one of the classics of Spanish prose literature. Ponca, not daring to await the coming of the Allies, took refuge in the mountains, abandoning his land to the ravage and ruin prepared for it by the Indians and Spaniards. Balboa, however, did not pursue his success further at present, leaving to the future the conquest, or, as he termed it, the pacification of the interior. He returned to the coast, where it was more for the advantage, security, and subsistence of the colony to have his friends or his vassals stationed. Careta had for a neighbour a cacique called by some Comogre, by others Panquiaco, chief of about 10,000 Indians, among whom were 3,000 warriors. Having heard of the valour and enterprise of the Castilians, the chief desired to enter into treaty and friendship with them, and the principal Indian, a dependent of Careta, having presented himself as the agent in this friendly overture, Vasco Nuñez, anxious to profit by the opportunity of securing such an ally, went with his followers to visit Comogre. No sooner was the cacique apprised of this visit than he sallied forth at the head of his principal vassals and his 7 sons, all still youths and the offspring of different wives, to receive the Spaniards. Great was the courtesy and kindness with which he treated his guests, who were lodged in different houses in the town, and provided with victuals in abundance, and with men and women to serve them. What chiefly attracted their attention was the habitation of Comogre, which, according to the memorials of the time, was an edifice of 150 paces in length and 80 in breadth, built on thick posts, surrounded by a lofty stone wall, and on the roof an attic story, of beautifully and skilfully interwoven wood. It was divided into several compartments, and contained its markets, its shops, and its pantheon for the dead. For it was in the corpses of the cacique's ancestors that the Spaniards first beheld these ghastly remains, dried and arranged as above described. The honours of the hospitality were confided to the eldest son of Comogre, a youth of more sagacity and intelligence than his brothers. He one day presented to Vasco Nuñez and to Colmenares, whom, from their manner and appearance, he recognized as chiefs of the party, 60 slaves and 4,000 pieces of gold of different weight. They immediately melted the gold, and having separated a fifth for the king, began to divide it among themselves. This division begat a dispute that gave occasion to threats and violence, which being observed by the Indian, he suddenly overthrew the scales in which they were weighing the precious metal, exclaiming, "Why quarrelling for such a trifle? If such is your thirst for gold that for its sake you forsake your own country and come to trouble those of strangers, I will show you a province where you may gather by the handful the object of your desire, but to succeed you ought to be more numerous than you are, as you will have to contend with powerful kings, who will vigorously defend their dominions. You will first find a cacique who is very rich in gold, who resides at the distance of 6 suns from hence. Soon you will behold the sea which lies to that part," and he pointed towards the south. "There you will meet with people who navigate in barks with sails and oars, not much less than your own, and who are so rich that they eat and drink from vessels made of the metal which ye so much covet." These celebrated words, preserved in all the records of the times, and repeated by all historians, were the first indications the Spaniards had of Peru. They were much excited on hearing them, and endeavoured to extract from the youth further information of the country he had mentioned. He insisted on the necessity of having at least 1,000 men, to give them a chance of success in its subjugation, offered to serve them himself as their guide, to aid them with his father's men, and to put his life in pledge for the veracity of his words. Balboa was transported by the prospect of glory and fortune which opened before him. He believed himself already at the gates of the East Indies, which was the desired object of the government and the discoverers of that period. He resolved to return in the first place to the Darien to raise the spirits of his companions with these brilliant hopes, and to make all possible preparations for realizing them. He remained, nevertheless, yet a few days with the caciques, and so strict was the friendship he had contracted with them, that they and their families were baptized, Carreta taking in baptism the name of Fernando, and Comogre that of Carlos. Balboa then returned to the Darien, rich in the spoils of Ponca, rich in the presence of his friends, and still richer in the golden hopes which the future offered him. At this time, and after an absence of 6 months, arrived the magistrate Valdivia, with a vessel laden with different stores. He brought likewise great promises of abundant aid in provisions and men. The succours, however, which Valdivia brought were speedily consumed. Their seed, destroyed in the ground by storms and floods, promised them no resource whatever, and they returned to their usual necessitous state. Balboa then consented to their extending their incursions to more distant lands, as they had already wasted and ruined the immediate environs of Antigua, and he sent Valdivia to Spain to apprise the Admiral of the clue he had gained to the South Sea, and the reported wealth of those regions. Valdivia took with him 15,000 pieces of gold which belonged to the King as his fifth, and a charge to petition for the 1,000 men which were necessary to the expedition, and to prevent the adventurers being compelled to exterminate the tribes and caciques of the Indians, for otherwise, being so few in number, they would be driven, to avoid their own destruction, to the slaughter of all who would not submit themselves. This commission, however, together with the rich presents in gold sent by the chiefs of the Darien to their friends, and Valdivia, with all his crew, were no doubt swallowed by the sea, as no trace of them was ever afterwards discovered. To the departure of Valdivia succeeded immediately the expedition to the Gulf and the examination of the lands situated at its inner extremity. There lay the dominions of Availle, of whose riches prodigious reports were spread, especially of an idol and a temple represented to be made entirely of gold. There Zschokke and the Indians who followed him had taken refuge, and had never lost either the wish or the hope of driving away the invading horde who had usurped their country. Balboa marched against them by land with 60 men, and Colmenares went by water with as many more to take the enemy by surprise. The former did not find Zschokke, but Colmenares was more fortunate, for he surprised the savages in Tichiri. He commanded the general to be shot with arrows in his presence, and sentenced the lords to be hanged; and so terrified were the Indians by this example that they never durst in future elevate their thoughts to independence. It was now deliberated to send new deputies to Spain to acquaint the King with the state of the colony, and on the road to touch at Española to entreat for necessary aid in case Valdivia might have perished on the voyage, which event had no doubt taken place. It is said that Balboa required this commission for himself, either ambitious of gaining favour at court, or apprehensive that the colony at Darien might inflict upon him punishment due to usurpation. But his companions would not consent to his quitting them, alleging that, in losing him, they should feel deserted and without a guide or governor. He only was respected, and followed willingly by the soldiers, and he only was feared by the Indians. They suspected that, if they permitted of his departure, he would never return to share those labours and troubles which were from time to time accumulating upon them, as had already happened with others. They elected Juan de Caicedo, the inspector, who had belonged to the armament of Nicuessa, and Rodrigo Enriquez de Colmenares, both men of weight and expert in negotiation, and held in general esteem. They believed that these would execute their charge satisfactorily, and that both would return, because Caicedo would leave his wife behind him, and Colmenares had realized much property and a farm in the Darien, pledges of confidence in and adhesion to the country. It being thus impossible for Balboa to proceed to Spain, in protection of his own interests he manoeuvred for gaining at least the good graces of the treasurer Pasamonte, and probably it was on this occasion that he sent him the rich present of slaves, pieces of gold, and other valuable articles, of which the licentiate Suazo speaks in his letter to the Señor de Chaves. At the same time the new procurators took with them the fifth which belonged to the king, together with a donative made him by the colony, and happier than their predecessors they left the Darien in the end of October and reached Spain the end of May in the year following. Soon after this departure a slight disturbance happened, which, though at first it threatened to destroy the authority of Vasco Nuñez, served in fact to strengthen it. Under pretence that Bartolomé Hurtado abused the particular favour of the Governor, Alonso Pérez de la Rúa and other unquiet spirits raised a seditious tumult. Their object was to seize 10,000 pieces, which yet remained entire, and divide them at their pleasure. After some contests, in which there were many arrests and a great display of animosity, the malcontents plotted to surprise Vasco Nuñez and throw him into prison. He knew it, and quitted the town as if going to the chase, foreseeing that, when these turbulent men had obtained possession of the authority and the gold, they would so abuse the one and the other, that all the rational part of the community would be in haste to recall him. And thus it was. Master of the Treasure, Rúa, and his friends showed so little decency in the partition, that the principal colonists, ashamed and disgusted, perceiving the immense distance that existed between Vasco Nuñez and these people, seized the heads of the sedition, secured them, and called back Balboa, whose authority and government they were anxious again to recognize. In the interim, 2 vessels laden with provisions and carrying 200 men, 150 of whom were soldiers commanded by Cristobal Serrano, arrived from Santo Domingo. They were all sent by the Admiral, and Balboa received from the Treasurer Pasamonte the title of Governor of that land, that functionary conceiving himself authorized to confer such a power, and having become as favourable as he had formerly been the reverse. Exulting in his title and his opportune success, and secured of the obedience of his people, Vasco Nuñez liberated his prisoners, and resolved to sally forth into the environs and to occupy his men in expeditions and discoveries. But while engaged in making his preparations, he received, to embitter his satisfaction, a letter from his friend Zamudio, informing him of the indignations which the charges of Encisco and the first information of the treasurer had kindled against him at court. Instead of his services being appreciated, he was accused as a usurper and intruder. He was made responsible for the injuries and prejudices of which his accuser loudly complained, and the founder and pacificator of the Darien was to be prosecuted for the criminal charges brought against him. This alloy, however, instead of subduing his spirit, animated him to new daring and impelled him to higher enterprises. Should he permit another to profit by his toils, to discover the South Sea, and to ravish from him the wealth and glory which were almost within his grasp? He did indeed still want the 1,000 men who were necessary to the projected expedition, but his enterprise, his experience, and his constancy impelled him to undertake it even without them. He would, by so signal a service, blot out the crime of his primary usurpation, and if death should overtake him in the midst of his exertions, he should die labouring for the prosperity and glory of his country, and free from the persecution which threatened him. Full of these thoughts, and resolved on following them, he discoursed with and animated his companions, selected 190 of the best armed and disposed, and with 1,000 Indians of labour, a few bloodhounds, and sufficient provisions, he set sail in a brigantine with 10 canoes. He ascended first to the port and territory of Careta, where he was received with demonstrations of regard and welcome suitable to his relations with that cacique, and leaving his squadron there, took his way by the sierras toward the dominion of Ponca. That chief had fled as at the first time, but Vasco Nuñez, who had adopted the policy most convenient to him, desired to bring him to an amicable agreement, and to that end despatched after him some Indians of peace, who advised him to return to his capital and to fear nothing from the Spaniards. He was persuaded and met with a kind reception. He presented some gold and received in return some glass beads and other toys and trifles. The Spanish captains then solicited guides and men of labour for his journey over the Sierras, which the caciques bestowed willingly, adding provisions in great abundance, and they parted friends. His passage into the domain of Quarecua was less pacific, whose chief Torrecha, jealous of this invasion and terrified by the events which had occurred to his neighbours, was disposed and prepared to receive the Castilians with a warlike aspect. A swarm of ferocious Indians, armed in their usual manner, rushed into the road and began a wordy attack upon the strangers, asking them what brought them there, what they sought for, and threatening him with perdition if they advanced. The Spaniards, reckless of their bravadoes, proceeded, nevertheless, and then the chief placed himself in front of his tribe, dressed in a cotton mantle, and followed by the principal lords, and, with more intrepidity than fortune, gave the signal for combat. The Indians commenced the assault with loud cries and great impetuosity, but soon terrified by the explosions of the crossbows and muskets, they were easily destroyed or put to flight by the men and bloodhounds who rushed upon them. The chief and 600 men were left dead on the spot, and the Spaniards, having smoothed away that obstacle, entered the town, which they spoiled of all the gold and valuables it possessed. Here also they found a brother of the cacique and other Indians, who were dedicated to the abominations before Glanstedt. 50 of these wretches were torn to pieces by the dogs, and not without the consent and approbation of the Indians. The district was, by these examples, rendered so pacific and so submissive, that Balboa left all his sick there, dismissed the guides given him by Ponca, and, taking fresh ones, pursued his road over the heights. The tongue of land which divides the two Americas is not at its utmost width above 18 leagues, and in some parts becomes narrowed to little more than 7. And although from the port of Careta to the point toward which the course of the Spaniards was directed was only altogether 6 days' journey, yet they consumed upon it 20. Nor is this extraordinary. The great Cordillera of Sierras, which from north to south crosses the new continent, a bulwark against the impetuous assaults of the Pacific Ocean, crosses also the Isthmus of Darien, or, as may be more properly said, composes it wholly from the wrecks of the rocky summits which have been detached from the adjacent lands, and the discoverers therefore were obliged to open their way through difficulties and dangers, which men of iron alone could have fronted and overcome. Sometimes they had to penetrate through thick and tangled woods, sometimes to cross lakes, where men and burdens perished miserably. Then a rugged hill presented itself before them, and next, perhaps, a deep and yawning precipice to descend, while at every step they were opposed by deep and rapid rivers, passable only by means of frail barks, or slight and trembling bridges. From time to time they had to make their way through opposing Indians, who, though always conquered, were always to be dreaded, and above all came the failure of provisions, which formed an aggregate with toil, anxiety, and danger, such as was sufficient to break down bodily strength and depress the mind. At length the Quarecuanos who served as guides showed them, at a distance, the height from whose summit the desired sea might be discovered. Balboa immediately commanded his squadron to halt, and proceeded alone to the top of the mountain. On reaching it, he cast an anxious glance southward, and the Austral Ocean broke upon his sight. Overcome with joy and wonder, he fell on his knees, extending his arms towards the sea, and with tears of delight offered thanks to Heaven for having destined him to this mighty discovery. He immediately made a sign to his companions to ascend, and pointing to the magnificent spectacle extended before them, again prostrated himself in fervent thanksgiving to God. The rest followed his example, while the astonished Indians were extremely puzzled to understand so sudden and general an effusion of wonder and gladness. Hannibal on the summit of the Alps, pointing out to his soldiers the delicious plains of Italy, did not appear, according to the ingenious comparison of a contemporary writer, either more transported or more arrogant than the Spanish chief when, risen from the ground, he recovered the speech of which sudden joy had deprived him, and thus addressed his Castilians: "You behold before you, friends, the object of all our desires and the reward of all our labours. Before you roll the waves of the sea which has been announced to you, and which no doubt encloses the immense riches we have heard of. You are the first who have reached these shores and these waves. Yours are their treasures, yours alone the glory of reducing these immense and unknown regions to the dominion of our King and to the light of the true religion. Follow me, then, faithful as hitherto, and I promise you that the world shall not hold your equals in wealth and glory." All embraced him joyfully, and all promised to follow whithersoever he should lead. They quickly cut down a great tree, and stripping it of its branches, formed a cross from it, which they fixed in a heap of stones found on the spot from whence they first descried the sea. The names of the monarchs of Castile were engraved on the trunks of the trees, and with shouts and acclamations they descended the Sierra and entered the plains. They arrived at Zamboyos, which formed the population of a chief called Chiapes, who had prepared to defend the pass with arms. The noise of the muskets and the ferocity of the war dogs dispersed them in a moment, and they fled, leaving many captives. By these, and by their Quarecuano guides, the Spaniards sent to offer Chiapes secure peace and friendship if he would come to them, or otherwise the ruin and extermination of his town and his fields. Persuaded by them, the cacique came and placed himself in the hands of Balboa, who treated him with much kindness. He brought and distributed gold, and received in exchange beads and toys, with which he was so diverted that he no longer thought of anything but contenting and conciliating the strangers. There Vasco Nuñez sent away the Quarecuanos, and ordered that the sick who had been left in their land should come and join him. In the meanwhile he sent Francisco Pizarro, Juan de Escareac, and Alonso Martin to reconnoitre the environs and to discover the shortest roads by which the sea might be reached. It was the last of these who arrived first at the coast, and entering a canoe which chanced to lie there, and pushing it into the waves, let it float a little while, and after pleasing himself with having been the first Spaniard who entered the South Sea, returned to seek Balboa. Balboa with 26 men descended to the sea, and arrived at the coast early in the evening of the 29th of that month. They all seated themselves on the shore and awaited the tide, which was at that time on the ebb. At length it returned in its violence to cover the spot where they were. Then Balboa, in complete armour, lifting his sword in one hand, and in the other a banner on which was painted an image of the Virgin Mary with the arms of Castile at her feet, raised it and began to march into the midst of the waves, which reached above his knees, saying in a loud voice: "Long live the high and mighty sovereigns of Castile! Thus in their name do I take possession of these seas and regions, and if any other prince, whether Christian or infidel, pretends any right to them, I am ready and resolved to oppose him, and to assert the just claims of my sovereigns." The whole band replied with acclamations to the vow of their captain, and expressed themselves determined to defend, even to death, their acquisition against all the potentates in the world. They caused this act to be confirmed in writing by the notary of the expedition, Andres de Valderrabano. The anchorage in which it was solemnized was called the Gulf of San Miguel, the event happening on that day. End of Section 34. End of the Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 8, edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rodd.